Step into the grandeur of one of the world's most formidable empires, where waves of conquest, fierce battles, and pivotal moments shaped entire continents. History alive. The Spanish Empire is not just a tale of power and ambition, but a deep journey through time, from the shores of the Americas to the battlefields of Europe. Hear the whispers of those who built this empire, the soldiers, visionaries, and rulers, as they recount the rise and eventual fall of a global force. Drift into sleep as the empire's stories unfold, painting a vivid portrait of an era that forever altered the course of history. History alive, where the past echoes softly into the present. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 marked the beginning of what would become the most extensive empire in human history. This union, celebrated in the Archbishop's Palace at Valladolid on October 19th, brought together two of the Iberian Peninsula's most powerful kingdoms under a single dynastic rule. Isabella, 18 years old and already demonstrating the political acumen that would define her reign, had chosen Ferdinand over other suitors, including the King of Portugal and the Duke of Gloucester. Ferdinand, a year her senior and heir to the crown of Aragon, brought with him not only his kingdom's territories in eastern Spain, but also its Mediterranean possessions including Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands. The political structure that emerged from this marriage was complex and deliberate. Rather than creating a unified kingdom, the Catholic monarchs, as they would later be known, maintained the separate legal and administrative systems of their respective realms, while coordinating their policies through personal union. Castile, with its vast interior territories and growing Atlantic ambitions, provided the demographic and economic foundation for future expansion. Its population of approximately 4 million inhabitants far exceeded that of Aragon's 800,000, and its agricultural wealth, derived from the vast sheep-herding operations of the Mester, generated substantial revenues. Aragon contributed its sophisticated Mediterranean trading networks, established diplomatic relationships, and experienced administrative apparatus that had governed diverse territories across the Western Mediterranean for centuries. The consolidation of their power required eliminating internal threats and establishing centralized authority. The Catholic monarchs systematically reduced the power of the nobility through a combination of military force and political maneuvering. They revoked numerous grants made by previous monarchs, reclaimed royal lands that had been distributed to nobles, and established the Santa Hermandad, a militia force that served as both a police organization and a counterweight to noble military power. This force, numbering approximately 10,000 men at its peak, patrolled the countryside and enforced royal justice in areas previously dominated by local lords. The military campaigns that followed demonstrated the effectiveness of their combined resources. The War of the Castilian Succession against Afonso V of Portugal and his supporter Juana la Beltrania tested the new monarch's ability to defend their throne. Ferdinand's tactical skills, honed through years of warfare in Catalonia and Roussillon, proved decisive in battles such as Toro in 1476, where Castilian heavy cavalry broke Portuguese lines in an engagement that lasted from dawn until midday. The victory secured Isabella's claim to the Castilian throne and established the military reputation that would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns. The completion of the Reconquista represented both the culmination of centuries of Christian expansion and the demonstration of Spanish military capabilities that would later prove decisive in European and American conflicts. The Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, controlled a territory encompassing modern-day Granada, Almeria, and Malaga provinces. Its ruler, Boabdil, commanded approximately 50,000 troops and controlled a series of formidable fortresses, including the Alhambra complex in Granada and the coastal strongholds of Malaga and Almeria. The Granada War showcased the military innovations that would characterize Spanish warfare for the next century. The Catholic monarchs employed a combination of siege warfare, diplomatic manipulation of internal Granada factions, and systematic territorial conquest. Their forces, numbering up to 80,000 men during major campaigns, included the emerging Spanish infantry formations that would later dominate European battlefields. These troops carried a combination of crossbows, early firearms, and traditional weapons, supported by artillery pieces that proved decisive in reducing Muslim fortifications. The Siege of Malaga in 1487 demonstrated the ruthless efficiency of Spanish military operations. The city, defended by approximately 15,000 inhabitants and soldiers, withstood a 4-month siege before surrendering. The Catholic monarch's response to the city's resistance was severe. They enslaved the entire population, selling approximately 11,000 people in markets across Castile and Aragon. This action served as both a source of revenue and a warning to other Muslim strongholds about the consequences of prolonged resistance. The final siege of Granada itself began in April 1491 with the construction of Santa Fe, a permanent military camp that housed the Spanish army throughout the winter. This settlement, laid out in a grid pattern with stone walls and permanent buildings, demonstrated Spanish logistical capabilities and their commitment to maintaining pressure on the Muslim capital. The siege involved approximately 150,000 Spanish troops and support personnel, making it one of the largest military operations in medieval European history. Boabdil's surrender on January 2, 1492 transferred control of Granada to the Catholic monarchs through the Treaty of Granada. The terms initially appeared generous, guaranteeing Muslims the right to maintain their religion, customs, and property. However, these provisions would prove temporary as subsequent policies aimed at achieving religious uniformity throughout Spanish territories. Christopher Columbus' arrival at the Spanish court in 1486 coincided with the final phases of the Granada War. The Genoese navigators' proposal to reach Asia by sailing westward across the Atlantic initially received skeptical reception from Spanish scholars and officials. However, Isabella's decision to support the expedition reflected both her religious motivations and her recognition of the potential economic benefits of establishing direct trade routes to Asian markets. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed on April 17, 1492, established the legal framework for Columbus' expedition and Spain's subsequent claims in the Americas. These agreements granted Columbus the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of any lands he might discover, along with 10% of all revenues generated from these territories. The document also specified that Columbus would provide 1/8 of the expedition's funding in exchange for 1/8 of the profits, while the Crown would supply the remaining resources. Columbus' first voyage departed from Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492 with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. The expedition included approximately 90 men, including sailors, soldiers, and interpreters fluent in Arabic who were expected to facilitate communication with Asian rulers. After a stop in the Canary Islands for repairs and supplies, the fleet sailed westward into unknown waters for 33 days before reaching the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. The papal bulls, issued by Alexander VI in 1493, provided the legal foundation for Spanish territorial claims in the Americas. The Intercetera bulls, issued on May 3 and 4, 1493, granted Spain dominion over all lands discovered or to be discovered west of a meridian located 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. These documents, based on the donation of Constantine and medieval theories of papal temporal authority, established Spain's exclusive right to colonize and Christianize the indigenous populations of the Americas. The Treaty of Tordesillas, negotiated with Portugal in 1494, modified the papal division by moving the demarcation line to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This adjustment, which Portugal demanded to protect its African trade routes, inadvertently granted Portugal claims to what would become Brazil, though this territory remained undiscovered at the time of the treaty's signing. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 represented a crucial component of the Catholic monarch's program of religious and political unification. Unlike the medieval Papal Inquisition, The Spanish Inquisition operated under royal rather than ecclesiastical authority, with the monarchs appointing inquisitors and controlling the institution's finances and procedures. Tomás de Torquemada, appointed as the first Inquisitor General in 1483, established the organizational structure and procedures that would govern the institution for centuries. The Inquisition's primary targets were conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish practices. The institution's operations involved elaborate procedures for investigating suspected heretics, including the use of informants, secret testimony, and torture to extract confessions. The auto de fe, public ceremonies where sentences were announced and executed, served both as religious ritual and public spectacle designed to demonstrate the consequences of religious nonconformity. The Alhambra Decree, issued on March 31, 1492, ordered the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. This edict affected approximately 200,000 people, representing about 2.5% of the Spanish population. The decree provided Jews with 4 months to either convert or leave Spanish territories, while prohibiting them from taking gold, silver, or other precious items with them. The economic impact of this expulsion was immediate and severe, as Jewish communities had played crucial roles in finance, trade, and skilled crafts throughout Spanish territories. The expulsion of Muslims followed a similar pattern, though it occurred gradually over several decades. The initial terms of Granada's surrender had guaranteed Muslim religious freedom, but Archbishop Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros' aggressive conversion campaigns in the late 1490s provoked resistance that provided justification for harsher measures. The Alpujarras Rebellion of 1499 to 1501, triggered by forced conversions and cultural suppression, resulted in the abrogation of the Treaty of Granada and the imposition of conversion or expulsion on Granada's Muslim population. The economic consequences of these expulsions were complex and long-lasting. Jewish communities had controlled significant portions of Spanish commerce and finance, with their departure creating immediate disruptions in credit networks and trade relationships. Many skilled artisans and merchants left with the expelled populations, taking their expertise to other Mediterranean centers such as Thessalonica, Amsterdam, and North African cities. The Crown confiscated substantial properties and assets from expelled populations, providing short-term revenue but eliminating long-term economic productivity. The demographic impact varied significantly across Spanish territories. Castile, with its larger Christian population, absorbed the economic disruption more easily than Aragon, where Muslim populations had constituted larger percentages of the total population in certain regions. Valencia and Catalonia experienced particular difficulties, as Muslim farmers and artisans had provided essential services in these areas. The establishment of religious uniformity also facilitated the development of a unified Spanish identity that would prove crucial in imperial expansion. The combination of Catholic faith, Castilian language, and royal authority created a coherent ideological framework that Spanish administrators and settlers would carry to the Americas. This religious unity provided justification for conquest and colonization, as Spanish expansion could be presented as a continuation of the Reconquista's mission to extend Christian rule over non-Christian populations. The institutional foundations established during this period would prove decisive in Spain's subsequent imperial expansion. The military experience gained in the Granada War, the administrative systems developed for governing diverse populations, and the legal frameworks established for territorial claims all contributed to Spanish success in the Americas. The Catholic monarch's ability to coordinate the resources of multiple kingdoms, their experience in siege warfare and urban conquest, and their systematic approach to religious and cultural integration provided the tools necessary for governing a global empire. The financial systems developed during this period also proved crucial for imperial expansion. The revenues generated from American silver would flow through administrative structures first established for managing the wealth of conquered Granada and the confiscated properties of expelled populations. The banking relationships developed with Italian and Flemish financiers during the Granada War would expand to support Spanish operations across multiple continents. By 1516, when Ferdinand died and the crown passed to his grandson Charles, the foundations of Spanish imperial power were firmly established. The unified monarchy controlled territories spanning from the Pyrenees to Gibraltar, from the Balearic Islands to the Canary Islands, and from Sicily to the newly discovered Caribbean islands. The military, administrative, and ideological tools necessary for global expansion were in place, awaiting only the demographic and economic resources that American colonization would provide. The death of Ferdinand in 1516 brought Charles of Habsburg to the Spanish throne, inheriting not only the unified Spanish kingdoms, but also the nascent American territories that would transform his realm into a global empire. Charles, who had spent his youth in the Netherlands under the tutelage of Flemish advisors, initially appeared ill-suited for Spanish rule. His inability to speak Castilian fluently and his reliance on foreign counselors provoked resentment among Spanish nobles, who had expected a more traditionally Spanish monarch. However, the young king's inheritance included territories that were already generating unprecedented wealth and strategic opportunities that would define the next 4 decades of Spanish expansion. The Caribbean islands had served as Spain's proving ground for colonial administration since Columbus' second voyage in 1493. Hispaniola, the largest and most developed of these early settlements, housed approximately 60,000 Spanish colonists by 1516, concentrated primarily in the island's economy depended heavily on sugar cultivation, which required intensive labor that the declining Taino population could no longer provide. Disease, warfare, and the brutal conditions of forced labor had reduced the indigenous population from an estimated 400,000 in 1492 to fewer than 60,000 by 1516. The encomienda system, formalized through a series of royal ordinances between 1503 and 1512, established the legal framework for Spanish colonial labor relations. This institution granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from specific indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and Christian instruction. Encomenderos, as these grant holders were known, typically controlled between 100 and 300 indigenous workers, though the largest grants encompassed several thousand people. The system theoretically protected indigenous rights while ensuring Spanish access to labor, but in practice it functioned as a form of legalized slavery that decimated native populations throughout the Caribbean. The Casa de Contratación, established in Seville in 1503, centralized control over American trade and colonization. This institution licensed all ships traveling to the Americas, collected customs duties on American goods, and maintained detailed records of colonial commerce. The Casa's officials examined every vessel's cargo, passengers, and crew before departure, ensuring that only authorized individuals and goods reached American territories. This system generated substantial revenues for the Crown while maintaining strict control over colonial development. The administrative structure that emerged in the Caribbean provided the template for Spanish colonial governance throughout the Americas. The Audiencia of Santo Domingo, established in 1511, served as the supreme court for all Spanish territories in the Caribbean, and initially extended its jurisdiction to the mainland territories that Spanish explorers were beginning to discover. This institution combined judicial, administrative, and legislative functions, with its judges serving as both legal officials and colonial administrators. Spanish exploration of the Caribbean proceeded systematically, with expeditions mapping coastlines, establishing settlements, and searching for gold deposits. Juan Ponce de Leon's exploration of Puerto Rico in 1508 revealed significant gold deposits that attracted hundreds of Spanish settlers. The conquest of the island proceeded rapidly, with Spanish forces employing war dogs, crossbows, and steel weapons against indigenous populations armed with wooden clubs and stone-tipped spears. By 1515, Puerto Rico's native population had been reduced to approximately 4,000 people, while Spanish colonists numbered nearly 3,000. Diego Velázquez's conquest of Cuba between 1511 and 1514 demonstrated the refined techniques that Spanish conquistadors had developed for subduing indigenous populations. Velázquez, who had served under Columbus and gained experience in Hispaniola's pacification, landed in Cuba with approximately 400 men equipped with firearms, crossbows, and horses. The expeditions systematically established 7 towns across the island, each serving as a base for controlling the surrounding territory and its indigenous inhabitants. The conquest of Cuba revealed the devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations. Smallpox, typhus, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through native communities that lacked immunity to these pathogens. Contemporary Spanish accounts describe entire villages abandoned as their inhabitants succumbed to illness, with mortality rates reaching 90% in some communities. This demographic catastrophe eliminated indigenous resistance, while creating the labor shortage that would drive Spanish demand for African slaves. The first African slaves arrived in the Caribbean in 1501, initially as domestic servants accompanying Spanish colonists. However, the rapid decline of indigenous populations transformed this limited presence into a systematic importation of enslaved Africans to work in sugar plantations and gold mines. By 1518, the Spanish crown had issued the first asiento, a contract granting exclusive rights to supply slaves to Spanish colonies. This document authorized the importation of 4,000 Africans annually, establishing the framework for the transatlantic slave trade that would transport millions of people from Africa to the Americas over the following centuries. The economic transformation of the Caribbean proceeded rapidly as Spanish colonists established sugar plantations, modeled on those developed in the Canary Islands and Madeira. These enterprises required substantial capital investment in processing equipment, including sugar mills powered by water wheels or animal traction. The largest plantations employed between 50 and 100 enslaved workers, with smaller operations utilizing 10 to 20 slaves. The profitability of sugar production attracted investment from Spanish merchants and Italian bankers, creating the financial networks that would later support mainland conquests. Reports of vast empires on the American mainland reached Spanish authorities in the Caribbean through indigenous traders and escaped captives who described cities larger than any in Europe and rulers who commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands. These accounts, initially dismissed as exaggerations, gained credibility as Spanish expeditions made contact with increasingly sophisticated indigenous societies along the Mexican and Central American coasts. Hernán Cortés' appointment as leader of the expedition to Mexico reflected the careful selection process that Spanish authorities employed for major conquests. Cortés, born in Medellín in 1485, had studied law at the University of Salamanca before traveling to Hispaniola in 1504. His experience in the Caribbean included participation in the conquest of Cuba, where he had demonstrated both military competence and administrative ability. Diego Velázquez selected Cortés to lead the Mexican expedition partly because of their personal relationship, but also because Cortés had invested his own resources in the venture, providing ships, supplies, and men for the enterprise. The expedition that departed Cuba in February 1519 included 630 men, 16 horses, 32 crossbows, 13 muskets, and 14 small cannons. This force, modest by European standards, represented the largest Spanish military expedition yet assembled in the Americas. The composition of Cortés' army reflected the diverse origins of Spanish colonists, with men from Castile, Andalusia, Extremadura, and other regions bringing different military traditions and expectations to the conquest. The Spanish landing at Cozumel provided the first indication of the sophisticated civilizations they would encounter on the mainland. The island's Maya inhabitants maintained stone temples, conducted complex religious ceremonies, and possessed detailed knowledge of mainland political conditions. Spanish accounts describe temples decorated with carved stone figures and painted murals depicting religious and historical scenes. The complexity of these structures, far exceeding anything Spanish explorers had encountered in the Caribbean, suggested that the mainland civilizations possessed organizational capabilities that would require different conquest strategies. The acquisition of Geronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero, Spanish castaways who had lived among the Maya for 8 years, provided Cortés with crucial intelligence about indigenous political structures and military capabilities. Aguilar, who had maintained his Spanish identity and Christian faith, served as an interpreter and cultural intermediary. His accounts of Maya warfare, political organization, and religious practices informed Spanish tactical planning throughout the subsequent campaign. The encounter with the Tabasco Maya demonstrated the decisive advantages that Spanish military technology provided against indigenous forces. The Battle of Kentla, fought on March 25, 1519, pitted Cortés' entire expedition against approximately 12,000 Maya warriors. The Spanish formation, anchored by crossbowmen and musketeers with cavalry protecting the flanks, maintained cohesion despite being vastly outnumbered. Spanish steel weapons, armor, and firearms proved devastatingly effective against Maya forces equipped with obsidian-edged clubs, spears, and cotton armor. The psychological impact of Spanish military technology equaled its physical effectiveness. Indigenous warriors had never encountered horses, which appeared to be single creatures combining human intelligence with animal strength and speed. The sound of gunfire, the sight of steel weapons cutting through traditional armor, and the disciplined formations of Spanish infantry created terror that often proved more decisive than actual casualties. Maya accounts, recorded decades later, describe Spanish soldiers as supernatural beings whose weapons produced thunder and lightning. The gift of 20 women from the defeated Tabasco Maya included Malintzin, known to the Spanish as Dona Marina, who would prove crucial to the conquest's success. Malintzin spoke both Maya and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire, enabling communication between Spanish forces and the various indigenous groups they would encounter. Her knowledge of Mesoamerican political structures, religious practices, and military customs provided Cortés with intelligence that proved decisive in subsequent negotiations and battles. The Spanish arrival at Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, marked the culmination of an 8-month march that had transformed a small expedition into the nucleus of a vast indigenous alliance against Aztec rule. The city that greeted Spanish eyes exceeded anything in contemporary Europe, with an estimated population of 200,000 to 300,000 inhabitants, connected by a network of canals, causeways, and bridges. The central ceremonial complex, dominated by the Templo Maya pyramid, rose 150 feet above the surrounding lake and could accommodate tens of thousands of religious ceremonies. Moctezuma's decision to receive the Spanish as guests rather than enemies reflected the complex religious and political calculations that Aztec rulers employed in dealing with foreign powers. The emperor, who commanded an empire stretching from the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico and encompassing millions of subjects, initially viewed the Spanish as potential allies against rebellious provinces rather than existential threats to Aztec power. This miscalculation, based on incomplete information about Spanish intentions and capabilities, provided Cortés with the opportunity to establish a base within the Aztec capital. The Spanish seizure of Moctezuma on November 14, 1519, demonstrated the audacious tactics that characterized Spanish conquests throughout the Americas. Cortés and approximately 30 Spanish soldiers entered the emperor's palace under the pretense of a diplomatic visit, then surrounded Moctezuma and demanded that he accompany them to Spanish quarters as a guarantee of peace. This action, which placed the ruler of 15 million people under the control of a few hundred foreigners, succeeded because Aztec political culture emphasized the sacred nature of imperial authority and the catastrophic consequences of harm to the emperor. The massacre at the Templo Mayor during the Festival of Tuxtla in May 1520 shattered the uneasy coexistence between Spanish forces and Aztec society. Pedro de Alvarado, commanding Spanish forces in Cortés' absence, ordered the killing of approximately 600 Aztec nobles and priests who were participating in religious ceremonies. Spanish accounts justify this action as a preemptive strike against a planned attack, while indigenous sources describe it as an unprovoked assault on unarmed ceremonial participants. The massacre destroyed any possibility of peaceful Spanish integration into Aztec society and triggered the uprising that would drive Spanish forces from the city. The Siege of Tenochtitlan, lasting from May 1521 to August 13, 1521, represented the largest military operation in the Americas to that point. Cortés' forces, numbering approximately 900 Spanish soldiers and 80,000 to 150,000 indigenous allies, systematically destroyed the city's defenses and cut off its food supplies. The Spanish construction of 13 brigantines to control Lake Texcoco demonstrated their adaptation to local conditions and their ability to project naval power in an inland environment. The fall of Tenochtitlan resulted from the combination of Spanish military technology, indigenous allies, and the devastating impact of smallpox on the city's population. The epidemic, which reached the city in 1520, killed an estimated 40% of the population, including Emperor Quetzalcoatl and many military leaders. The disease's impact on Aztec military effectiveness exceeded that of Spanish weapons as entire units became incapacitated and the city's defensive preparations collapsed. The wealth extracted from the conquered Aztec Empire exceeded Spanish expectations and provided the resources necessary for subsequent conquests. The initial distribution of Aztec treasure yielded approximately 162,000 pesos de oro for the Spanish crown, with additional amounts distributed among expedition members. However, the systematic exploitation of indigenous labor through the encomienda system and the discovery of silver deposits generated far greater long-term revenues. Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire demonstrated how Spanish conquistadors had refined their techniques for subduing large indigenous states. Pizarro, who had participated in Balboa's expedition across the Isthmus of Panama and had gained experience in Central American conquests, organized his Peruvian expedition with careful attention to the lessons learned from Cortés' Mexican campaign. The expedition that departed Panama in 1531 included 180 men, 37 horses, and a small number of firearms, representing a force even smaller than that which had conquered the Aztec Empire. The capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca on November 16, 1532 replicated the successful tactics that Spanish conquistadors had employed against indigenous rulers throughout the Americas. Pizarro's forces, concealed in buildings surrounding the town's central plaza, waited until the Inca emperor and his retinue entered the square before launching their attack. The Spanish cavalry charge, supported by infantry and firearms, killed approximately 2,000 Inca soldiers and nobles while suffering no casualties themselves. The ransom demanded for Atahualpa's release, a room filled with gold and 2 rooms filled with silver, revealed the vast wealth that the Inca Empire had accumulated through centuries of expansion and tribute collection. The treasure collected at Cajamarca weighed approximately 13,420 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver, representing the largest single accumulation of precious metals that Europeans had ever encountered. This wealth, distributed among expedition members according to their rank and contribution, provided the foundation for Spanish colonial society in Peru. The execution of Atahualpa on July 26, 1533, despite the payment of his ransom, demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism that characterized Spanish colonial policy. Pizarro's decision to kill the emperor reflected his assessment that Atahualpa alive posed a continuing threat to Spanish control, regardless of any agreements or guarantees. This action, which violated Spanish promises and legal procedures, established the precedent for Spanish treatment of indigenous rulers throughout the Americas. The Spanish march to Cusco and the capture of the Inca capital in November 1533 completed the conquest of the empire's political center. The city, with its precisely fitted stone construction and elaborate ceremonial complexes, impressed Spanish observers as equal to any European capital. The systematic looting of Cuzco's temples and palaces yielded additional treasure that exceeded even the Cajamarca ransom, with Spanish accounts describing rooms filled with gold and silver objects that required weeks to inventory and melt down. The establishment of Spanish colonial administration in Peru proceeded more systematically than in Mexico, benefiting from the experience gained in previous conquests. The encomienda system, refined through decades of application in the Caribbean and Mexico, provided the framework for extracting labor and tribute from indigenous populations. The largest encomiendas in Peru controlled tens of thousands of indigenous workers, generating revenues that supported Spanish colonial society and provided substantial payments to the crown. The discovery of the Potosi silver deposits in 1545 transformed the economic significance of the Peruvian conquest and provided Spain with the resources necessary to finance its European wars and global expansion. The Mountain of Silver, as Spanish sources described it, contained deposits of unprecedented richness that could be extracted using indigenous labor and mercury amalgamation techniques. The mines at Potosi would eventually produce more silver than had existed in all of Europe before the American conquests. The development of the transatlantic trade system connected American production with European markets through a carefully regulated network of shipping routes and commercial controls. The fleet system, formalized in the 1540s, required all American trade to pass through designated ports and travel in armed convoys that could defend against piracy and foreign attack. The annual treasure fleets, carrying silver from Peru and Mexico to Seville, transported wealth that would finance Spanish military operations from the Netherlands to the Philippines. The importation of African slaves to replace declining indigenous populations accelerated dramatically following the mainland conquests. The Spanish crown issued increasingly large asientos, with contracts in the 1540s authorizing the importation of thousands of slaves annually. The profits generated by American silver mining and sugar production provided the capital necessary to purchase slaves on the African coast, while the labor shortage in American colonies created constant demand for additional workers. The demographic catastrophe that accompanied Spanish expansion continued throughout this period, with indigenous populations declining by 80 to 90% in most areas. Disease remained the primary cause of mortality, but warfare, forced labor, and social disruption contributed to the demographic collapse. Spanish colonial society adapted to these conditions by importing African slaves, developing new forms of labor organization, and establishing racial hierarchies that would define colonial social structures for centuries. The accession of Charles V to the Spanish throne in 1516 marked the beginning of an unprecedented concentration of European power under a single ruler. At 16 years old, Charles inherited not only the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon with their American territories, but also the Burgundian Netherlands, the Free County of Burgundy, and various Italian possessions through his paternal grandmother, Mary of Burgundy. When his paternal grandfather Maximilianus died in 1519, Charles added the Habsburg Austrian lands and successfully campaigned for election as Holy Roman Emperor, creating a territorial complex that encircled France and stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Hungary. The sheer geographical extent of Charles's domains presented administrative challenges that no previous European ruler had confronted. The Holy Roman Empire alone encompassed over 300 separate political entities, each with distinct legal traditions, economic systems, and cultural identities. The German princes, both Catholic and Protestant, maintained substantial autonomy and viewed imperial authority with suspicion. The Netherlands, comprising 17 provinces with thriving commercial cities like Antwerp and Amsterdam, generated enormous wealth through trade and manufacturing, but demanded extensive local privileges in exchange for tax payments. Spain provided the demographic foundation and American revenues that financed Charles's European wars, But Spanish nobles expected their monarch to prioritize Iberian interests over German or Italian concerns. Charles's election as Holy Roman Emperor required extensive bribery of German electors, costing approximately 850,000 florins borrowed from the Fugger banking house of Augsburg. This debt, secured against future American silver revenues, established the financial pattern that would characterize Habsburg rule for the next century. The emperor's resources, however vast, never proved sufficient to meet the simultaneous demands of defending against Ottoman expansion in the east, suppressing Protestant rebellion in Germany, containing French ambitions in Italy, and maintaining Spanish control over the expanding American empire. The revolt of the Castilian communes in 1520 to 1521 demonstrated the domestic resistance that Charles faced even in his most loyal territories. The comuneros, led by Juan de Padilla in Toledo and Juan Bravo in Segovia, objected to the new king's appointment of foreign advisors, his departure from Spain to claim the imperial crown, and the heavy taxation required to finance his European ambitions. The rebellion attracted support from urban artisans, minor nobles, and clergy, who viewed Charles's imperial responsibilities as threats to traditional Spanish privileges and interests. The Battle of Villalar on April 23, 1521, where imperial forces defeated the Comunero army and executed its leaders, established Charles's authority in Castile through military force rather than negotiation. The victory eliminated organized resistance to Habsburg rule, but also demonstrated the fragility of Spanish loyalty when royal policies conflicted with local interests. Charles learned from this experience to govern Spain through Spanish advisors, and to present his imperial policies as extensions of Spanish greatness rather than foreign impositions. The simultaneous challenge of the Germania's revolt in Valencia and the Balearic Islands revealed the social tensions that rapid economic change had created in Spanish society. The Germanias, guilds of artisans and small merchants, initially organized to defend coastal cities against North African piracy, but evolved into a social movement demanding greater political participation and economic protection. The revolt's suppression required 2 years of intermittent warfare and left lasting resentment among the urban middle classes who had supported the movement. Charles's wars against Francis and of France dominated European politics for 3 decades and consumed enormous resources that might otherwise have supported American colonization or domestic development. The Italian Wars, which began before Charles's accession and continued until 1559, centered on competing claims to Milan, Naples, and other Italian territories. The Battle of Pavia on February 24, 1525, where imperial forces captured Francis I himself, demonstrated Spanish military superiority, but failed to resolve the underlying territorial disputes that kept Europe in constant warfare. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 by Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottoman forces represented the greatest external threat to Charles's empire and to Christian Europe generally. The Ottoman army, numbering approximately 120,000 men with 300 cannons, reached the Habsburg capital after conquering most of Hungary and defeating a Christian army at Mohacs in 1526. The successful defense of Vienna, conducted primarily by Spanish and German troops under the command of Nicholas Graf Somme, prevented Ottoman expansion into Central Europe but required enormous expenditures that strained imperial finances. The Protestant Reformation posed an even more complex challenge to Charles's authority, combining religious dissent with political rebellion and social revolution. Martin Luther's posting of the 95 Theses in 1517 had coincided with Charles's accession to the Spanish throne, and the reform movement spread rapidly through German territories where local rulers saw religious independence as a path to political autonomy. The Diet of Worms in 1521, where Charles declared Luther an outlaw, established the emperor's opposition to Protestant doctrine but proved incapable of preventing the movement's continued expansion. The formation of the Schmalkaldic League in 1531 united Protestant princes and cities in military alliance against imperial authority. The League's membership included powerful territories such as Saxony and Hesse, along with important commercial cities like Strasbourg and Augsburg. The Protestant forces could field armies totaling 50,000 men and possess the financial resources to sustain prolonged warfare against imperial troops. Charles's attempts to suppress the League through military force proved initially successful, particularly at the Battle of Mulberg in 1547, but failed to achieve lasting religious or political settlement. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 represented Charles's acknowledgement that religious unity could not be restored to the Holy Roman Empire through military means. The settlement established the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, allowing each territorial ruler to determine the religion of his subjects. This compromise preserved imperial authority while accommodating Protestant demands for religious autonomy, but it also fragmented the empire's religious and political unity in ways that would prove irreversible. The abdication of Charles V in 1556 reflected both his personal exhaustion and his recognition that the Habsburg territories had become too extensive for effective governance by a single ruler. The emperor's decision to divide his inheritance between his son Philip II, who received Spain, the Netherlands, and the Italian possessions, and his brother Ferdinand, who inherited the Austrian lands and the imperial title, acknowledged the practical impossibility of maintaining unified control over such diverse territories. Philip II's accession to the Spanish throne brought a fundamentally different approach to Habsburg governance. Unlike his father, who had been raised in the Netherlands and viewed himself as a universal Christian monarch, Philip was thoroughly Spanish in education, temperament, and political outlook. He established his capital permanently in Madrid, centralized decision-making in the royal bureaucracy, and pursued policies designed to maximize Spanish power rather than maintain European equilibrium. The construction of the Escorial, begun in 1563, symbolized Philip's conception of Spanish monarchy as the defender of Catholic orthodoxy and the center of global empire. The massive complex, combining royal palace, monastery, and mausoleum, required 21 years to complete and employed over 1,500 workers at its peak. The building's austere granite facade and geometric design reflected both Philip's personal piety and his systematic approach to governance. The Escorial's library, containing over 45,000 volumes and its archives, housing correspondence from across the Spanish Empire, made it the administrative center of the first truly global empire in human history. Philip's marriage to Mary Tudor in 1554 had temporarily united Spain and England under Habsburg rule and demonstrated Spanish diplomatic influence in Northern Europe. Although the marriage produced no children and ended with Mary's death in 1558, it established Spanish claims to involvement in English affairs that would persist throughout Philip's reign. The accession of Elizabeth I, a Protestant queen who rejected Philip's marriage proposal, transformed England from potential ally to active enemy of Spanish interests. The annexation of Portugal in 1580 represented Philip's greatest territorial acquisition and completed Spanish control over the Iberian Peninsula. The succession crisis following the death of King Sebastian at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in 1578 provided Philip with legal claims to the Portuguese throne through his mother, Isabella of Portugal. The Spanish invasion of Portugal in 1580, led by the Duke of Alba with 37,000 troops, encountered minimal resistance from a population exhausted by political instability and economic decline. The union of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns created the world's first global empire, with territories spanning 6 continents and encompassing approximately 13 million square kilometers. Spanish control of Portuguese territories included Brazil, with its expanding sugar plantations and growing slave population, the African trading posts that supplied slaves to American colonies, and the Asian territories from Goa to Macau that connected European trade with the wealth of the Indies. The Portuguese fleet, including over 300 ocean-going vessels, doubled Spanish naval capacity and provided the ships necessary for maintaining communications across global distances. The administration of this expanded empire required unprecedented bureaucratic sophistication and financial resources. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524, had already developed procedures for governing American territories through a hierarchy of viceroys, audiencias, and local officials. The incorporation of Portuguese territories required similar administrative structures, with the Council of Portugal created in 1582 to oversee the former Portuguese Empire. The Casa de Contratación in Seville expanded its operations to handle the increased volume of global trade, while new institutions in Lisbon managed Portuguese commercial networks. The Battle of Lepanto, on October 7, 1571, demonstrated Spanish naval supremacy in the Mediterranean and marked the beginning of Ottoman naval decline. The Holy League fleet, commanded by Don John of Austria, Philip's illegitimate half-brother, included 206 galleys and 6 galleasses carrying approximately 28,000 soldiers and 50,000 sailors and rowers. The Spanish contingent, comprising 81 galleys, formed the center of the Christian battle line and bore the brunt of the Ottoman attack. The Ottoman fleet, under the command of Ali Pasha, numbered 230 galleys and 56 galleets, carrying an estimated 34,000 soldiers and 13,000 sailors. The Ottoman vessels, built for speed and maneuverability, had dominated Mediterranean warfare for decades through superior tactics and the fighting skills of Janissary troops. The battle began at dawn with the Ottoman fleet arranged in a crescent formation designed to envelop the Christian line, while the Holy League forces maintained a more compact formation that maximized their firepower advantage. The decisive moment came when the Spanish center, led by Don John's flagship Real, broke through the Ottoman line and engaged Ali Pasha's flagship Sultana in direct combat. The fighting on both vessels involved hand-to-hand combat, with swords, pikes, and firearms at point-blank range. The death of Ali Pasha, killed by a Spanish arquebusier, demoralized the Ottoman center and triggered the collapse of their battle line. The Christian victory resulted in the capture or destruction of 170 Ottoman vessels and the liberation of approximately 12,000 Christian galley slaves. The strategic consequences of Lepanto extended far beyond the immediate military results. The Ottoman defeat ended their expansion in the Western Mediterranean and forced them to concentrate their naval resources in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Spanish control of the Western Mediterranean became virtually complete, allowing secure communication between Spain and its Italian possessions while protecting the North African coast from Ottoman expansion. The economic impact of American silver on European markets reached its peak during Philip's reign, with annual imports averaging 300 tons of silver and 20 tons of gold between 1571 and 1580. The silver fleet system, refined through decades of experience, transported this wealth from American mines to Seville through heavily defended convoys that rarely suffered significant losses to piracy or enemy action. The treasure fleets, departing annually from Veracruz and Cartagena, carried not only precious metals but also exotic goods including cochineal, indigo, vanilla, and chocolate that commanded high prices in European markets. The price revolution, triggered by the massive influx of American silver, transformed European economic structures and contributed to Spain's emergence as the dominant financial power. Spanish silver circulated throughout Europe, financing trade, supporting manufacturing, and providing the monetary foundation for economic expansion. The increased money supply drove inflation that averaged 2 to 3% annually throughout the 16th century, a rate that seemed modest by later standards but represented unprecedented monetary expansion for the period. Spanish financial dominance manifested itself through the international banking networks that developed to handle American silver. The Genoese bankers, led by families such as the Spinola and Doria, established credit systems that allowed Spanish silver to finance operations from the Netherlands to the Philippines. The fairs of Medina del Campo became the primary European center for international exchange, where Spanish silver was converted into credit instruments that supported trade and investment throughout the continent. The persistent debt problems that plagued Spanish finances, despite unprecedented revenues, reflected the enormous costs of maintaining global empire and European hegemony. Philip inherited debts totaling approximately 36 million ducats from his father, and his own military expenditures quickly exceeded current revenues. The cost of maintaining 150,000 troops in the Netherlands alone consumed 4 million ducats annually, while the defense of Mediterranean territories against Ottoman attack required additional millions. The Spanish bankruptcies of 1557, 1575, and 1596 demonstrated the limitations of even the world's greatest financial resources when confronted with the expenses of global warfare. These financial crises, which suspended payments to creditors and forced renegotiation of debt terms, disrupted European credit markets and damaged Spanish prestige. However, the underlying strength of American silver production allowed Spain to recover from each crisis and resume its military operations with minimal long-term consequences. The development of Spanish military power during this period established the tactical and organizational foundations that would dominate European warfare for the next century. The Spanish tercios, infantry formations combining pikemen, arquebusiers, and swordsmen in flexible tactical units, proved superior to traditional medieval military organizations. These formations, typically numbering 3,000 men organized in companies of 250 soldiers each, could operate independently or combine with other tercios to form larger armies. The Spanish military system integrated American wealth with European military technology and Spanish organizational skills to create the most effective fighting force of the 16th century. The regular payment of troops, made possible by American silver, maintained discipline and morale that mercenary forces rarely achieved. The systematic training of officers in Spanish military academies produced professional leadership that could adapt to diverse tactical situations and coordinate complex operations across multiple theaters. The global reach of Spanish military power became apparent through simultaneous operations in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Spanish forces defended Vienna against Ottoman siege, suppressed rebellion in the Netherlands, conquered Portuguese territories in Africa and Asia, and extended colonial control throughout the Americas. This global military presence required logistical capabilities that no previous empire had developed, including the coordination of supply lines spanning thousands of miles and the maintenance of communication networks that connected Madrid with Manila, Mexico City, and Milan. The establishment of the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535 marked the transformation of Spanish colonial administration from improvised military governance to systematic imperial control. Antonio de Mendoza, appointed as the first viceroy, arrived in Mexico City with explicit instructions to create administrative structures capable of governing territories larger than all Europe. The vice-regal palace, constructed on the ruins of Moctezuma's residence, symbolized the replacement of indigenous political authority with Spanish imperial administration. Mendoza's court included over 200 officials, clerks, and servants who established the bureaucratic apparatus that would govern Spanish America for 3 centuries. The Viceroyalty of New Spain encompassed territories stretching from Panama to the northern frontiers of present-day United States, including the Caribbean islands, Central America, Mexico, and the Philippines. This vast domain contained approximately 15 million inhabitants by 1550, with indigenous populations concentrated in the central Mexican highlands and Maya regions of the Yucatan Peninsula. The administrative challenge of governing such diverse territories required the development of new governmental institutions that could accommodate different indigenous political traditions while maintaining Spanish control over taxation, labor, and religious practice. The creation of the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1542 completed the initial organization of Spanish South America under centralized administration. Blasco Núñez Vela, the first viceroy, faced immediate resistance from Spanish colonists who viewed viceregal authority as a threat to their encomienda privileges and local autonomy. The civil wars that racked Peru throughout the 1540s demonstrated the difficulties of imposing royal authority over colonists who possessed independent military capabilities and economic resources. The defeat and execution of Núñez Vela by Gonzalo Pizarro's forces in 1546 revealed the limitations of Spanish administrative control when confronted with organized colonial resistance. The eventual suppression of the Peruvian rebellion by Pedro de la Gasca in 1548 established viceregal authority through a combination of military force and political negotiation. La Gasca's army, numbering approximately 8,000 men recruited from loyal colonists and newly arrived Spanish troops, defeated Pizarro's forces at the Battle of Chiquijuana through superior artillery and the defection of key rebel commanders. The execution of Gonzalo Pizarro and 340 of his supporters eliminated the leadership of colonial resistance, while demonstrating the Crown's determination to maintain imperial control regardless of the costs involved. The audiencia system provided the judicial foundation for Spanish colonial administration, with these high courts serving as both legal tribunals and administrative councils. The Audiencia of Mexico, established in 1527, initially consisted of 4 judges appointed directly by the Crown for terms of 6 years. These officials, known as oidores, possessed extensive authority over civil and criminal cases, administrative disputes, and appeals from local courts. The Audiencia's jurisdiction extended throughout New Spain, with its decisions subject to appeal only to the Council of the Indies in Seville. The Audiencia of Lima, created in 1542, faced more complex challenges due to the vast distances and diverse populations of South America. The court's jurisdiction initially extended from Panama to Chile, encompassing territories that required months of travel to reach from the capital. The establishment of additional audiencias in Santa Fe de Bogotá, Charcas, and Quito reflected the practical impossibility of governing South America from a single administrative center. These courts developed specialized procedures for handling cases involving indigenous law, commercial disputes, and conflicts between ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The encomienda system, formalized through the new laws of 1542, established the legal framework for Spanish exploitation of indigenous labor, while theoretically protecting native rights and promoting Christian conversion. The encomienda grants, distributed to Spanish colonists based on their service in the conquest, typically included between 100 and 500 indigenous tributaries, who were required to provide labor and tribute payments to their encomendero. The largest grants, such as those held by Hernán Cortés' descendants, encompassed thousands of indigenous workers and generated annual revenues exceeding 100,000 pesos. The tribute obligations imposed on indigenous communities varied according to local conditions and Spanish labor needs. In central Mexico, indigenous communities typically provided 20 to 30 days of labor annually, along with tribute payments in kind including maize, beans, cotton textiles, and other local products. The tribute assessments, conducted by Spanish officials every few years, established the specific obligations of each community based on population counts and productive capacity. These assessments often exceeded indigenous communities' ability to pay, forcing them to sell land or borrow money to meet Spanish demands. The transformation of the encomienda system into the hacienda system during the late 16th century reflected changing Spanish economic priorities and the demographic collapse of indigenous populations. The haciendas, large agricultural estates owned directly by Spanish colonists, replaced the indirect control of the encomienda with direct ownership of land and permanent employment of indigenous workers. The Hacienda de Santa Ladilla, established north of Mexico City in the 1580s, encompassed over 400,000 acres and employed more than 1,000 workers in agricultural production, livestock raising, and textile manufacturing. The development of debt peonage provided Spanish landowners with mechanisms for controlling indigenous labor, despite the formal abolition of slavery. Indigenous workers, advanced money for tools, clothing, and subsistence, found themselves unable to repay these debts due to low wages and inflated prices at hacienda stores. The legal requirement that workers remain on haciendas until their debts were paid created a system of labor control that differed little from slavery in its practical effects. Spanish colonial courts consistently upheld the validity of these debt contracts, making escape from peonage virtually impossible through legal means. The establishment of Spanish towns throughout the Americas created administrative centers that served as focal points for colonial control and cultural transformation. The laws of the Indies, codified in 1573, specified the precise layout and organization of colonial settlements, requiring central plazas surrounded by government buildings, churches, and residences for Spanish officials. The town of Puebla, founded in 1531, exemplified this planned approach to urban development with its grid pattern of streets, central cathedral, and designated areas for different social groups reflecting Spanish concepts of social order and urban organization. The cabildo, or town council, provided the primary mechanism for local governance in Spanish colonial settlements. These institutions, modeled on Castilian municipal governments, included positions for mayors, aldermen, and other officials elected annually by Spanish residents. The cabildo's authority extended to market regulation, public works, defense organization, and the administration of justice in minor civil and criminal cases. The wealth required for cabildo membership, typically including property ownership and business investments, ensured that local government remained under the control of Spanish colonists and their descendants. The Catholic Church's role in colonial administration extended far beyond religious instruction to encompass education, social welfare, and cultural transformation. The mendicant orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians established the first missions in central Mexico during the 1520s, with each order assigned specific territories for evangelization. The Franciscan mission of Tlatelolco, established in 1536, included a college for training indigenous nobles in Latin, Spanish, and Christian doctrine. The college's curriculum, taught by Spanish friars and indigenous assistants, produced a generation of indigenous leaders who served as intermediaries between Spanish colonial administration and native communities. The systematic destruction of indigenous religious practices accompanied the construction of Christian churches and the establishment of Catholic festivals. Spanish missionaries ordered the demolition of indigenous temples, the burning of religious manuscripts, and the prohibition of traditional ceremonies that they identified as idolatrous. The Ordo de Fe conducted by Bishop Diego de Landa in Yucatan in 1562 resulted in the destruction of thousands of Maya books and religious objects, along with the torture and execution of indigenous religious leaders who refused to abandon traditional practices. The development of syncretic religious practices demonstrated indigenous adaptation to Spanish religious requirements while maintaining elements of traditional belief systems. The cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which emerged in central Mexico during the 1530s, combined Catholic veneration of the Virgin Mary with indigenous religious symbolism and ritual practices. The shrine established at Tepeyac, a site previously sacred to the Aztec goddess Tenantzin, attracted thousands of indigenous pilgrims who participated in ceremonies that blended Christian and pre-Columbian elements. The Inquisition's extension to the Americas in 1569 created additional mechanisms for enforcing religious orthodoxy and social control. The Tribunal of the Holy Office in Mexico City, established with jurisdiction over all of New Spain, conducted investigations of suspected heretics, blasphemers, and practitioners of prohibited religious activities. The Inquisition's primary targets included Spanish colonists suspected of Protestant sympathies, Portuguese merchants accused of Judaism, and indigenous leaders who continued to practice traditional religions despite formal conversion to Christianity. The casta system, which emerged during the late 16th century, legally codified the racial hierarchies that Spanish colonialism had created through the interaction of European, indigenous, and African populations. The Sistema de Castas established 16 primary racial categories, each with specific legal rights, social privileges, and economic opportunities. Peninsulars, Spanish-born colonists, occupied the highest social position with exclusive access to the most important governmental and ecclesiastical offices. Criollos, American-born descendants of Spanish colonists, possessed substantial wealth and social status, but faced legal restrictions on their participation in colonial administration. The mestizo population, resulting from unions between Spanish men and indigenous women, occupied an intermediate position in colonial society, with greater opportunities than indigenous people but fewer privileges than those of Spanish descent. The complex terminology that developed to describe different racial mixtures reflected Spanish obsession with maintaining social hierarchies based on perceived racial purity. Terms such as castizo, morisco, and chino created legal categories that determined individuals' social status, marriage prospects, and economic opportunities. The African slave population, imported to replace declining indigenous workers, occupied the lowest position in colonial society, but developed their own internal hierarchies based on origin, skills, and legal status. Bozoles, slaves imported directly from Africa, commanded lower prices and faced greater restrictions than criollos, slaves born in the Americas who spoke Spanish and possessed familiarity with colonial society. The skilled slaves who worked as artisans, domestic servants, and overseers often achieved better living conditions and greater personal autonomy than those employed in agricultural, labor, or mining operations. The development of free black and mulatto populations created additional complexity in colonial racial hierarchies. Manumission, the legal process of freeing slaves, occurred through various mechanisms including purchase, testamentary grants, and recognition of military service. The free black population, numbering approximately 100,000 by 1650, faced legal restrictions on residence, occupation, and social interaction but possessed greater economic opportunities than enslaved Africans. The militia units composed of free blacks and mulattoes provided military service in exchange for limited social privileges and exemption from certain colonial restrictions. The mining economy that developed around the deposits of Potosi and Zacatecas created new forms of labor organization that combined Spanish capital, indigenous workers, and African slaves. The mita system, adapted from Inca labor obligations, required indigenous communities to provide workers for mining operations on a rotating basis. The mita of Potosi, established in 1573, conscripted approximately 13,500 indigenous workers annually from communities throughout the Andes. These workers, known as mateos, received wages for their labor but faced extremely dangerous working conditions that resulted in high mortality rates. The mercury amalgamation process, introduced to American silver mining in the 1550s, revolutionized ore processing and increased silver production dramatically. The technique, which used mercury to extract silver from crushed ore, required substantial capital investment in processing facilities and steady supplies of mercury from the Huancavelica mines in Peru. The environmental consequences of mercury mining and processing created health hazards that affected indigenous workers and surrounding communities for generations. The Spanish Crown's monopoly on mercury sales provided additional revenue while ensuring control over silver production throughout the Americas. The economic integration of Spanish America proceeded through the development of regional trading networks that connected mining centers with agricultural and manufacturing regions. The Mexico City-Acapulco trade route linked Asian goods imported through the Manila Galleon with Mexican silver and European manufacturers. The annual trade fair at Portobello connected South American silver with European goods transported across the Isthmus of Panama. These commercial networks generated substantial profits for Spanish merchants, while creating economic dependencies that reinforced colonial political control. The demographic catastrophe that accompanied Spanish colonization continued throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, with indigenous populations declining by 80 to 90% in most regions. Disease remained the primary cause of mortality, with epidemics of smallpox, typhus, and measles recurring every few years in indigenous communities that lacked acquired immunity. The epidemic of 1576 to 1581, known as the Great Cocalesli, killed an estimated 2 million people in central Mexico alone. The social disruption caused by these demographic disasters undermined indigenous political structures and facilitated Spanish cultural and religious transformation of native societies. The Spanish colonial administration's response to demographic decline included efforts to concentrate surviving indigenous populations in planned settlements known as congregations or reductions. These programs, implemented throughout Spanish America during the late 16th century, relocated indigenous families from scattered rural communities to centralized towns where Spanish officials could more effectively control their labor, collect tribute, and supervise religious instruction. The Congregation of 1603 to 1606 in central Mexico relocated approximately 400,000 indigenous people to 200 planned communities, abandoning thousands of smaller settlements and concentrating the population in areas more convenient for Spanish administration. The Spanish Armada's departure from Lisbon on May 30, 1588, represented the culmination of 2 years of preparation and the largest naval expedition that Europe had ever witnessed. The fleet assembled under the command of the Duke of Medina Sidonia comprised 130 ships carrying 30,493 men, including 19,295 soldiers, 8,252 sailors, and 2,088 galley slaves. The expedition's primary vessels included 20 galleons of the Indian Guard, 4 galleasses from Naples, 4 galleys from Portugal, and 34 armed merchantmen converted for military service. The fleet carried 2,431 pieces of artillery, ranging from massive 50-pounder cannons to small anti-personnel weapons, along with 123,790 rounds of shot and 5,175 quintals of gunpowder. Philip II's strategic conception for the Armada operation reflected his understanding of Spanish naval limitations and English defensive capabilities. The plan required the fleet to sail through the English Channel, establish control of the Strait of Dover, and provide naval protection for the Duke of Palma's invasion army of 17,000 veteran troops stationed in the Netherlands. This force, composed primarily of Spanish tertioses with extensive combat experience in the Dutch wars, would cross the Channel in flat-bottom barges once the Armada had neutralized English naval opposition and secured the invasion route. The English fleet that awaited the Spanish approach had been organized under Lord Admiral Charles Howard of Effingham, with Sir Francis Drake serving as Vice Admiral. The English assembled approximately 200 vessels of various sizes, though only 34 were royal galleons comparable to Spanish warships. The remainder consisted of armed merchantmen, coastal defense vessels, and smaller craft pressed into service for the emergency. The English advantage lay not in ship numbers but in tactical flexibility, superior seamanship, and the revolutionary naval gunnery techniques that English captains had developed through decades of privateering against Spanish shipping. The first engagement occurred off Plymouth on July 31, 1588, when Drake's squadron attacked the Spanish rearguard as the Armada proceeded eastward along the English coast. The Spanish formation, arranged in a defensive crescent with the most powerful galleons protecting the flanks, maintained its cohesion despite English harassment. The Rosario, commanded by Pedro de Valdez, suffered damage to its foremast and fell behind the main fleet, where Drake's Revenge captured it along with 55,000 ducats in gold intended for paying Parma's army. The loss of this treasure ship and its experienced crew represented the first significant Spanish casualty of the campaign. The running battle that continued for a week as the Armada sailed through this channel demonstrated the fundamental tactical differences between Spanish and English naval warfare. Spanish commanders, trained in Mediterranean galley combat, sought to close with English vessels and employ their superior numbers of soldiers in boarding actions. The English, with their longer-range culverins and more maneuverable ships, maintained distance while delivering repeated broadsides that gradually weakened Spanish formations without accepting the close combat that Spanish tactics required. The Spanish anchoring off Calais on August 6 placed the Armada in an exposed position where it could neither retreat safely nor advance toward its rendezvous with Parma's invasion force. The Duke of Medina Sidonia's decision to anchor reflected his awareness that the invasion barges were not ready for immediate departure, and that the fleet required resupply before continuing operations. However, the anchorage left the Spanish formation vulnerable to the fireships that English commanders had prepared for precisely this situation. The fireship attack launched on the night of August 7th. 8 scattered the Spanish formation and eliminated any possibility of maintaining the disciplined defensive arrangement that had protected the fleet throughout its passage up the channel. 8 English vessels, loaded with combustible materials and fitted with guns that would fire as the flames reached them, drifted into the Spanish anchorage driven by wind and tide. The Spanish response, cutting anchor cables and sailing hastily into the North Sea, prevented catastrophic losses but destroyed the formation integrity that Spanish tactical doctrine required for effective naval combat. The Battle of Gravelines on August 8, 1588, represented the decisive engagement of the campaign and demonstrated the superiority of English naval gunnery over Spanish tactics. The scattered Spanish ships, no longer able to maintain mutual support, faced individual English attacks that exploited their superior firepower and maneuverability. The San Lorenzo, flagship of the Galea squadron, ran aground on Calais Beach where English boats captured it along with its crew and treasure. The Spanish galleon San Mateo, after sustaining hours of English bombardment, drifted helplessly toward the Flemish coast with over 200 casualties among its crew. The English gunnery advantage became apparent through the systematic damage inflicted on Spanish vessels during the Gravelines engagement. English culverins, firing 18-pound iron shot at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, penetrated Spanish hulls and rigging while remaining beyond the effective range of Spanish anti-ship artillery. The Spanish guns, designed primarily for close-range combat against galleass, proved inadequate for the long-range artillery duels that characterized channel warfare. The Maria Juan sank during the battle, becoming the only major Spanish vessel lost to direct enemy action during the entire campaign. The Spanish retreat into the North Sea eliminated any possibility of linking with Palma's invasion force, and forced the Armada to attempt the dangerous return voyage around Scotland and Ireland. The Duke of Medina Sidonia's decision to continue northward, rather than fight his way back through the Channel, reflected his assessment that the fleet lacked the ammunition and cohesion necessary for another major engagement with English forces. The Spanish fleet, reduced to approximately 100 vessels after the Channel battles, faced the prospect of navigating unfamiliar waters without adequate charts or local knowledge. The storms that battered the Spanish fleet during its passage around the Isles inflicted far greater losses than English naval action had achieved. The Atlantic gales, combined with the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland, wrecked over 20 Spanish vessels and drowned thousands of sailors and soldiers. The Girona, carrying survivors from 2 other wrecked galleons, sank off the Irish coast with the loss of 1,300 lives. The Spanish ships that reached Irish shores faced hostile populations who killed survivors or sold them as slaves, eliminating any possibility of organizing resistance or securing local assistance. The Armada's return to Spanish ports in September and October 1588 revealed the extent of the disaster that had befallen Spanish naval power. Only 67 ships reached Spanish harbors, with many of these so damaged as to be unfit for further service. The human casualties exceeded 15,000 dead, including experienced naval officers, veteran soldiers, and skilled sailors whose loss could not be easily replaced. The financial cost of the expedition, estimated at 10 million ducats, represented nearly 2 years of American silver revenues, and forced Philip II to declare another bankruptcy in 1596. The strategic consequences of the Armada's failure extended far beyond the immediate military losses and established English naval confidence that would persist for centuries. The demonstration that Spanish naval power could be defeated encouraged other European nations to challenge Spanish maritime supremacy and open new opportunities for English expansion in the Atlantic and Caribbean. The psychological impact of the defeat undermined Spanish prestige throughout Europe and encouraged rebellions in the Netherlands, France, and other territories under Spanish control. The Dutch revolt, which had begun in 1566 as a protest against Spanish taxation and religious persecution, gained new momentum following the Armada's defeat. The northern provinces, organized under the Union of Utrecht since 1579, had maintained their independence through a combination of military resistance and diplomatic alliances with France and England. The Spanish Army of Flanders, commanded by Alessandro Farnese, had achieved significant successes during the 1580s, recapturing Antwerp in 1585 and reducing rebel-held territory to the provinces north of the Great Rivers. The diversion of Spanish resources to the Armada expedition provided Dutch forces with the opportunity to launch counteroffensives that recovered much of the territory lost during the previous decade. Maurice of Nassau, appointed Stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland in 1587, implemented military reforms that transformed the Dutch army from a collection of mercenary bands into a disciplined force capable of challenging Spanish tercios in open battle. The Dutch innovations included smaller, more flexible infantry units, improved artillery tactics, and systematic training programs that created professional officer corps. The Siege of Breda in 1590 demonstrated the effectiveness of Dutch military reforms and marked the beginning of Spanish defensive warfare in the Netherlands. Maurice's army, numbering approximately 7,000 men with modern siege artillery, invested the Spanish garrison of 900 soldiers commanded by Edward Lanzavecchia. The siege lasted 7 months, with Dutch engineers employing advanced fortification techniques learned from Italian military theorists. The Spanish relief attempts, hampered by the need to maintain garrisons throughout the southern Netherlands, proved inadequate to break the Dutch siege lines. The Spanish financial crisis that followed the Armada disaster severely limited Philip II's ability to maintain adequate forces in the Netherlands. The bankruptcy declaration of 1596 suspended payments to Spanish troops, triggering mutinies that paralyzed military operations throughout the Low Countries. The Spanish garrison of Aalst mutinied in November 1596, seizing the town and demanding 6 months back pay before agreeing to resume military duties. Similar mutinies occurred in over 20 Spanish-held towns, creating opportunities for Dutch forces to advance into previously secure Spanish territory. The Battle of Nieuwpoort on July 2, 1600, represented the first major field engagement between reformed Dutch forces and Spanish tercios, demonstrating that Spanish infantry supremacy was no longer absolute. Maurice of Nassau's army, numbering 11,000 men with 22 cannons, encountered Archduke Albert's Spanish force of 10,000 veterans near the Flemish coast. The Dutch tactical innovations, including coordinated artillery and infantry attacks supported by cavalry charges, broke the Spanish battle line and forced the withdrawal of forces that had been considered invincible for decades. The 12 Years' Truce, negotiated between 1607 and 1609, represented Spanish acknowledgement that military reconquest of the northern Netherlands was no longer feasible. The truce agreement, signed on April 9, 1609, established a temporary cessation of hostilities while implicitly recognizing Dutch independence through the treatment of the rebel provinces as sovereign negotiating partners. The Spanish delegation, led by Ambrosio Spinola, accepted terms that would have been unthinkable during the height of Spanish power, including Dutch retention of all territory under their control and the right to trade in the East Indies. The outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618 created new demands on Spanish resources that prevented the resumption of effective military operations in the Netherlands. The Bohemian Revolt, triggered by the defenestration of Prague on May 23, 1618, challenged Habsburg authority in Central Europe and threatened the Catholic-Protestant balance that had maintained relative peace since the Peace of Augsburg. Philip III's decision to support his Habsburg cousin Ferdinand II required the commitment of Spanish troops and subsidies that might otherwise have been employed against Dutch independence. The Spanish intervention in the Rhineland, designed to maintain communications between Spanish territories in Italy and the Netherlands, created a new theater of operations that stretched Spanish resources beyond their capacity. The Army of Flanders, commanded by Ambrosio Spinola, included approximately 60,000 men distributed among garrisons throughout the southern Netherlands, field armies operating against Dutch forces and expeditionary forces supporting imperial operations in Germany. The annual cost of maintaining these forces exceeded 3.5 million ducats, consuming the majority of American silver revenues and requiring additional borrowing from Italian and German bankers. The Siege of Ostend, lasting from July 1601 to September 1604, exemplified the enormous costs and limited results of Spanish military operations during this period. The Spanish investment of this Dutch-held port required 120,000 men over 3 years, with casualties exceeding 80,000 killed and wounded. The final capture of Ostend provided Spain with a strategic port, but at a cost that exceeded the value of the position and demonstrated the impossibility of reconquering the Netherlands through conventional siege warfare. The resumption of warfare in the Netherlands in 1621 following the expiration of the 12 Years' Truce revealed the extent to which Spanish military capabilities had deteriorated during the intervening period. The Dutch West India Company, established in 1621, challenged Spanish control of American territories and shipping routes, capturing the Brazilian port of Salvador in 1624 and the entire Spanish silver fleet in 1628. These losses, totaling over 15 million ducats, forced Philip IV to declare bankruptcy in 1627 and 1647, disrupting Spanish military operations throughout Europe. The French declaration of war against Spain in 1635 opened a new front that required the diversion of Spanish forces from the Netherlands to defend the frontiers of Catalonia and the Spanish Netherlands. Cardinal Richelieu's strategy of attacking Spanish territories on multiple fronts while supporting Dutch and German Protestant forces created strategic pressures that Spanish resources could not sustain. The French capture of Corbie in 1636 threatened Paris, but required Spanish forces that might otherwise have been employed against Dutch advances in the eastern Netherlands. The Catalan Revolt of 1640, triggered by Spanish attempts to impose Castilian military and fiscal obligations on Catalonia, created internal challenges that further weakened Spanish capacity for foreign warfare. The revolt, supported by French subsidies and military assistance, established an independent Catalan republic that controlled Barcelona and much of northeastern Spain. The Spanish forces required to suppress this rebellion, numbering over 20,000 men, could not be employed in the Netherlands or Germany, allowing Dutch and French forces to achieve significant territorial gains. The Portuguese Restoration of 1640 eliminated Spanish control over Portuguese territories and naval resources that had been crucial to Spanish global strategy since 1580. The Duke of Braganza's proclamation as King John IV of Portugal deprived Spain of the Portuguese fleet, Brazilian revenues and Asian trading posts that had supported Spanish operations in Europe and the Americas. The Spanish attempts to reconquer Portugal, continuing until 1668, required military resources that further reduced Spanish effectiveness in other theaters. The Battle of Rocroi on May 19, 1643, marked the definitive end of Spanish military supremacy in Europe and demonstrated that Spanish tercios could no longer dominate European battlefields. The French army, commanded by the Duke of Enghien, numbering 23,000 men with 20 cannons, defeated the Spanish force of 27,000 veterans under Francisco de Melo. The destruction of the Spanish infantry, which had maintained its reputation for invincibility since the Italian Wars, eliminated the psychological advantage that Spanish arms had enjoyed for over a century. The Peace of Westphalia, signed on October 24, 1648, formally ended the 30 Years' War and established the principle of state sovereignty that would govern European international relations for centuries. The Spanish delegation, led by the Count of Penaranda, accepted terms that recognized Dutch independence, confirmed French territorial gains in Alsace, and acknowledged the right of German princes to conduct independent foreign relations. The treaty's provisions eliminated Spanish influence in German affairs and reduced Spanish territory in the Netherlands to the southern provinces that would later become Belgium. The Treaty of the Pyrenees, negotiated between 1658 and 1659, represented Spanish acceptance of French hegemony in European affairs and marked the end of Spanish aspirations to continental dominance. The treaty, signed on November 7, 1659, ceded Roussillon, Cerdagne and parts of Flanders to France while arranging the marriage of Louis XIV to Philip IV's daughter, Maria Theresa. The Spanish territorial concessions, combined with the payment of Maria Theresa's dowry of 500,000 gold crowns, represented the final acknowledgement of Spanish decline and French ascendancy in European politics. The death of Charles II on November 1, 1700, without direct heirs, precipitated the most severe succession crisis in Spanish history and fundamentally transformed the nature of Spanish imperial governance. The Habsburg king's will, naming Philip of Anjou as his successor, brought the grandson of Louis XIV to the Spanish throne, but triggered immediate opposition from the Grand Alliance of England, Austria, and the Dutch Republic. These powers, fearing the potential union of French and Spanish crowns under Bourbon rule, declared war on the new King Philip V in May 1702, launching a conflict that would devastate Spanish territories and reshape European balance of power for the next century. The War of Spanish Succession engulfed Spain in fighting that extended from the Pyrenees to Gibraltar, from Barcelona to Cadiz, while simultaneously involving Spanish territories in Italy, the Netherlands, and the Americas. The Archduke Charles of Austria, supported by English and Dutch fleets, established his court in Barcelona in 1705 and claimed the Spanish crown as Charles III. The Catalan nobility, resentful of Castilian centralization policies implemented during the previous century, welcomed the Austrian pretender and provided him with military support that controlled most of Catalonia and Valencia by 1706. The English capture of Gibraltar in August 1704 provided the alliance with a permanent naval base in the Mediterranean, while the occupation of Minorca in 1708 completed British control of strategic positions that threatened Spanish communications with Italy. The Battle of Almanza on April 25, 1707 marked the turning point of the war in Spain and demonstrated the military effectiveness of the reformed Spanish army under French supervision. The Duke of Berwick, Philippe as French commander, deployed 25,000 troops in a coordinated assault that shattered the Allied army of 15,000 English, Dutch, and Portuguese soldiers commanded by Henri de Rouvigny. The Spanish victory, achieved through superior artillery coordination and disciplined infantry advances, eliminated Allied control of eastern Spain and forced the evacuation of Madrid, which had been briefly occupied by the Archduke Charles in 1706. The systematic reduction of Valencia and Aragon that followed Almanza restored Bourbon control over territories that had supported the Austrian claimant since the war's beginning. The Treaty of signed on April 11, 1713 formally ended the War of Spanish Succession and established the territorial arrangements that would define European politics throughout the 18th century. Philip V retained the Spanish crown in American territories but renounced any claim to the French throne, while ceding the Spanish Netherlands to Austria, Sicily to Savoy, and Minorca and Gibraltar to Great Britain. The commercial provisions of the treaty granted Britain the asiento, the exclusive right to supply slaves to Spanish America, along with permission to send one ship annually to trade in Spanish colonial ports. These concessions, forced upon Spain by military defeat, fundamentally altered the economic relationship between Spain and its American empire by breaking the monopoly system that had channeled colonial wealth exclusively through Spanish merchants. The establishment of the Bourbon dynasty brought French administrative practices and governmental philosophy to Spanish imperial governance, transforming institutions that had remained essentially unchanged since the 16th century. Philip V, educated at Versailles and advised by French ministers, implemented centralization policies designed to eliminate the regional privileges and autonomous institutions that had characterized Habsburg rule. The Nueva Planta decrees, issued between 1707 and 1716, abolished the fueros of Catalonia, Valencia, and Aragon, replacing traditional legal systems with Castilian law and administrative structures. The Catalan courts, which had met regularly since the 13th century, was permanently dissolved, while the Generalitat and other autonomous institutions were replaced by royal intendants appointed directly from Madrid. The intendant system, adapted from French administrative practice, created a new class of professional administrators responsible for implementing royal policies in provincial territories. These officials, typically drawn from the lesser nobility or educated bourgeoisie, possessed extensive authority over taxation, military recruitment, public works, and commercial regulation. The Intendant of Catalonia, established in Barcelona in 1717, supervised the collection of new taxes imposed to compensate for loss of traditional revenues, while coordinating the construction of military fortifications designed to prevent future rebellions. The systematic nature of Bourbon administrative reform extended to detailed regulations governing everything from municipal governments to guild organizations, replacing the complex web of privileges and exemptions that had characterized Habsburg governance. The creation of new governmental institutions reflected Bourbon determination to maximize colonial revenues and improve administrative efficiency throughout the Spanish Empire. The Ministry of the Indies, established in 1714, centralized colonial administration under direct royal control, reducing the autonomy that the Council of the Indies had exercised since the 16th century. The new ministry, staffed by professional administrators rather than noble appointees, implemented systematic reforms designed to increase American silver production, expand agricultural exports, and reduce the administrative costs that had consumed substantial portions of colonial revenues. The appointment of José de Galvez as Visitor General of New Spain in 1765 exemplified this new approach, as his extensive tours of Mexican territories produced detailed reports on administrative inefficiencies, tax collection problems, and opportunities for economic development. The establishment of new viceroyalties reflected both the expansion of Spanish territorial control and the need for more effective administration of distant provinces. The Viceroyalty of New Granada, created in 1717 but permanently established in 1739, encompassed the territories of present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, with its capital at Santa Fe de Bogotá. The new viceroyalty's creation responded to the strategic importance of Caribbean defenses and the need for more direct control over the gold mines of New Granada and the emerald deposits of Muzo. The Viceroy Antonio Caballero y Góngora, appointed in 1782, implemented extensive reforms that increased royal revenues by 40%, while establishing new roads, schools, and administrative offices throughout the territory. The Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, established in 1776 with its capital at Buenos Aires, represented the most significant territorial reorganization of the 18th century and reflected Spanish concerns about Portuguese expansion in southern Brazil. The new viceroyalty included the territories of present-day Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia, bringing the wealthy silver mines of Potosí under Buenos Aires administration rather than Lima. The creation of this viceroyalty facilitated direct trade between Europe and the Rio de la Plata region, reducing the transportation costs that had made South American goods uncompetitive in European markets. The viceroy Juan José de Verdes, who governed from 1778 to 1784, established new ports, improved river navigation, and created the first printing press in Buenos Aires, transforming the city from a minor frontier settlement into a major commercial center. The implementation of the intendant system in the Americas proceeded gradually, with the first appointments made in Cuba in 1764 and extended to New Spain in 1786. The intendants, appointed for terms of 5 years and prohibited from engaging in commercial activities, possessed authority over taxation, military affairs, public works, and judicial administration within their provinces. The Intendant of Puebla, established in 1787, supervised the collection of alcabala taxes, managed the construction of roads connecting Mexico City with the port of Veracruz, and coordinated the establishment of new schools and hospitals throughout the region. The systematic nature of intended administration produced detailed statistical reports that provided Spanish authorities with unprecedented information about colonial economic conditions, population distribution, and administrative efficiency. The expulsion of the Jesuits from all Spanish territories on June 25, 1767, represented the most dramatic administrative reform of the Bourbon period and eliminated an institution that had wielded enormous influence in colonial society for over 2 centuries. Charles III Pragmatic Sanction, implemented simultaneously throughout the Spanish Empire, ordered the immediate arrest and deportation of approximately 5,000 Jesuit priests and brothers, along with the confiscation of all society properties. The expulsion, carried out with military precision, removed the Jesuits from 678 establishments, including colleges, missions, haciendas, and urban residences that had made the society the largest landowner in Spanish America. The Jesuit missions in Paraguay, which had governed approximately 100,000 Guarani Indians in 30 reductions, represented the most extensive experiment in indigenous self-government under European supervision. These communities, established during the early 17th century, had developed sophisticated agricultural systems, manufacturing operations, and educational programs that produced high levels of literacy and technical skill among indigenous populations. The Jesuit expulsion disrupted these communities, leading to the abandonment of several reductions and the dispersal of indigenous populations who had lived under mission protection for generations. The Spanish administrators who replaced Jesuit governance lacked the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary for effective indigenous relations, resulting in declining agricultural production and increasing social unrest. The economic impact of the Jesuit expulsion extended far beyond the missions to affect colonial education, agriculture, and commerce throughout Spanish America. The society had operated the most prestigious colleges in major cities, providing education for the sons of colonial elites and training clergy for service throughout the empire. The College of San Pedro and San Pablo in Mexico City, established in 1573, had educated generations of colonial administrators, lawyers, and ecclesiastics, while maintaining the largest library in the Americas with over 40,000 volumes. The closure of Jesuit educational institutions created immediate shortages of qualified personnel for colonial administration and forced the reorganization of educational systems that had remained stable for centuries. The confiscation of Jesuit properties provided Spanish authorities with assets valued at over 30 million pesos, making the expulsion one of the largest property transfers in colonial history. The Jesuit hacienda of Santa Lucia, encompassing over 400,000 acres north of Mexico City, included agricultural lands, livestock operations, and manufacturing facilities that employed more than 1,000 workers. The Spanish administration of confiscated properties, managed through the Junta de Temporalidades, proved less efficient than Jesuit management, with many estates experiencing declining productivity and increasing debt. The sale of former Jesuit properties to private purchasers, conducted throughout the 1770s and 1780s, created new opportunities for colonial investment, while eliminating the corporate landholding that had characterized much of colonial agriculture. The frontier defense systems that the Jesuits had maintained in northern Mexico, Paraguay, and other border regions collapsed following the expulsion, creating security problems that Spanish military forces proved unable to address effectively. The Jesuit missions in Sonora and Sinaloa had served as barriers against Apache and Comanche raids, while providing intelligence about indigenous movements and maintaining diplomatic relations with tribal leaders. The Spanish military presidios that replaced Jesuit missions lacked the cultural knowledge and linguistic skills necessary for effective indigenous relations, resulting in increased warfare and the abandonment of frontier settlements. The cost of maintaining military garrisons exceeded the expenses of Jesuit missions, while providing less effective protection for Spanish colonists and indigenous allies. The increasing economic competition from British and French colonial empires during the 18th century challenged Spanish control over American trade, and forced the implementation of commercial reforms that fundamentally altered colonial economic relationships. The British acquisition of the Asiento in 1713 provided legal access to Spanish-American markets, while British merchants used this privilege to engage in extensive contraband trade that undermined Spanish commercial monopolies. The annual permission ship, theoretically limited to 500 tons of British goods, regularly exceeded this limit through the practice of transferring cargo from accompanying vessels during the voyage. British merchants established permanent representatives in Spanish-American ports, creating commercial networks that competed directly with Spanish trade and provided American consumers with manufactured goods at lower prices than Spanish suppliers could offer. The French expansion in the Caribbean and Louisiana created additional challenges to Spanish commercial control, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico and the northern frontiers of New Spain. The establishment of New Orleans in 1718 provided France with a strategic position controlling access to the Mississippi River system, while French traders developed commercial relationships with indigenous peoples throughout the Louisiana Territory. The French ability to offer European manufactured goods in exchange for American raw materials created economic incentives that drew trade away from Spanish merchants and reduced the effectiveness of Spanish commercial regulations. The cession of Louisiana to Spain in 1762 eliminated French competition in this region, but required Spanish resources to defend and administer territories that generated limited revenues. The implementation of Comercio Libre, beginning with the Caribbean islands in 1765 and extended to all Spanish-American territories by 1778, represented the most significant reform of colonial commercial policy since the establishment of the fleet system in the 16th century. The new regulations eliminated the requirement that all American trade pass through Seville and Cadiz, allowing Spanish merchants from 12 designated ports to trade directly with American colonies. The reform also reduced tariff rates, simplified customs procedures, and eliminated many of the restrictions that had made Spanish goods uncompetitive in colonial markets. The immediate result was a substantial increase in trade volume, with Spanish exports to America increasing by 400% between 1778 and 1788. The establishment of new commercial companies, modeled on British and Dutch trading corporations, provided Spanish merchants with the capital and organization necessary to compete in global markets. The Royal Company of Havana, chartered in 1740, received exclusive rights to develop Cuban tobacco production and export, while the Barcelona Company, established in 1755, managed trade with Venezuela and the development of cacao plantations. These companies, funded through the sale of shares to private investors, provided the capital necessary for large-scale agricultural development, while generating profits that supported further commercial expansion. The success of the Caracas Company in developing Venezuelan cacao production demonstrated the potential for Spanish commercial enterprise when provided with adequate capital and freedom from restrictive regulations. The creation of consulados in major American cities provided Spanish merchants with institutional support for commercial activities and legal resolution of trade disputes. The Consulado of Mexico City, established in 1592, had served as a model for commercial organization, but the creation of new consulados in Buenos Aires, Guadalajara, and other cities reflected the decentralization of commercial authority that accompanied the Comercio Libre reforms. These institutions, governed by elected merchant representatives, possessed jurisdiction over commercial disputes, supervised the construction of commercial infrastructure, and coordinated the collection of commercial taxes. The Buenos Aires Consulado, established following the creation of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, facilitated the development of direct trade between Europe and the southern cone of South America, reducing the transportation costs that had made Buenos Aires goods uncompetitive in European markets. The expansion of Spanish naval power during the 18th century reflected both the need to defend American territories against foreign attack and the desire to maintain Spanish control over colonial trade routes. The naval construction program initiated under Philip V and expanded under Charles III created a fleet of over 60 ships of the line by 1790, making the Spanish Navy the third largest in Europe after Britain and France. The shipyards at Ferrol, Cartagena, and Havana produced vessels incorporating the latest naval technology, while the Naval Academy at Cadiz, established in 1717, trained officers in navigation, gunnery, and naval tactics. The Spanish fleet's effectiveness was demonstrated during the American Revolutionary War, when Spanish naval forces successfully defended Caribbean territories against British attack, while supporting French operations in North American waters. The scientific expeditions sponsored by the Spanish crown during the 18th century reflected Bourbon commitment to rational administration and systematic knowledge of imperial territories. The Royal Botanical Expedition to New Granada, led by José Celestino Mutis from 1783 to 1808, cataloged over 20,000 plant species while training colonial scientists in botanical classification and pharmaceutical preparation. The expedition's work conducted throughout present-day Colombia and Venezuela produced detailed maps, scientific illustrations, and economic reports that provided Spanish authorities with unprecedented knowledge of colonial natural resources. The Malaspina expedition, which circumnavigated the globe from 1789 to 1794, combined scientific research with strategic reconnaissance, producing detailed charts of Pacific coastlines while assessing the defensive capabilities of Spanish-American territories. The implementation of new taxation systems in the Americas generated the increased revenues that financed Bourbon administrative reforms while creating social tensions that would contribute to independence movements. The establishment of royal tobacco monopolies in New Spain and Peru eliminated private tobacco cultivation and marketing, requiring indigenous and mestizo farmers to sell their crops to government purchasing agents at fixed prices. The monopoly system generated substantial revenues for the crown, with tobacco taxes contributing over 4 million pesos annually to royal finances by 1800. However, the restrictions on tobacco cultivation and trade created economic hardship for small farmers and provided focal points for popular resistance to Spanish authority. The expansion of the alcabala tax system, which imposed duties on internal commercial transactions, generated additional revenues while creating administrative complexity that required extensive bureaucratic expansion. The alcabala, traditionally collected at rates of 2 to 4% on commercial sales, was increased to 6% in many regions and extended to transactions previously exempt from taxation. The collection of these taxes required detailed record-keeping and extensive supervision, creating employment for colonial administrators while generating resentment among merchants and consumers who bore the cost of increased taxation. The establishment of new customs houses in provincial cities and the appointment of additional tax collectors represented the expansion of Spanish administrative presence throughout colonial society. The French invasion of Spain on March 23, 1808 shattered the administrative foundations of the Spanish Empire and created the political vacuum that colonial independence movements would exploit over the next 17 years. Napoleon's decision to place his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne eliminated the legitimate source of authority that had governed Spanish America for 3 centuries, while the imprisonment of Ferdinand VII at Bayonne removed the personal loyalty that bound colonial elites to the Spanish crown. The news of these events, carried by merchant vessels and official dispatches, reached American territories between May and August 1808, triggering immediate political crises in every major colonial center, from Mexico City to Buenos Aires. The establishment of provincial juntas throughout Spain in response to French occupation provided the constitutional precedent that American colonists would invoke to justify their own autonomous governments. The Junta of Seville, formed on May 27, 1808, claimed authority over all Spanish territories as the legitimate representative of the imprisoned Ferdinand VII, while simultaneously demanding that American colonies continue remitting taxes and obeying Spanish commercial regulations. The Junta of Cadiz, established on June 6, 1808, made similar claims while competing directly with Seville for recognition as the supreme authority in Spanish affairs. These competing claims created confusion throughout the empire, about which Spanish authority possessed legitimate jurisdiction over colonial territories. The Creole elite's response to the constitutional crisis revealed the fundamental tensions that Spanish colonial policy had created between American-born and peninsular-born Spaniards. In Mexico City, the Cabildo demanded on July 19, 1808, that Viceroy José de Iturragare convene a Congress of Representatives from throughout New Spain to determine the colony's response to events in Europe. The Creole lawyers and merchants who dominated the Cabildo argued that sovereignty reverted to the people in the absence of legitimate royal authority, and that New Spain possessed the right to govern itself until Ferdinand VII's restoration. The peninsular merchants and officials, organized through the Consulado of Mexico City, opposed any deviation from established colonial administration and demanded continued obedience to whatever Spanish authority could maintain effective control. The coup d'état of September 15, 1808 that removed Viceroy Iturragare and arrested prominent Creole leaders demonstrated the determination of peninsular Spaniards to maintain their privileged position in colonial society. Gabriel de Yermo, a wealthy peninsular merchant, led approximately 300 armed supporters in seizing the vice-regal palace and installing Pedro de Garibay as the new viceroy. The arrest of Melchor de Talamantes, a Peruvian friar who had drafted proposals for Mexican autonomy, along with other Creole intellectuals, eliminated the moderate leadership that might have negotiated a peaceful transition to greater colonial self-government. The violent suppression of Creole political aspirations in Mexico City established the pattern of peninsular intransigence that would characterize Spanish responses to American demands throughout the independence period. The Hidalgo Revolt, which began on September 16, 1810 in the village of Dolores, transformed the political crisis into a social revolution that threatened the entire structure of colonial society. Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a 57-year-old parish priest with extensive education in theology and philosophy, had participated in the Querétaro conspiracy that planned to establish an autonomous government in New Spain. The discovery of the conspiracy by colonial authorities forced Hidalgo to launch his movement prematurely, but his decision to appeal directly to indigenous and mestizo populations created a mass uprising that within weeks encompassed most of central Mexico. The Grito de Dolores, delivered from the steps of the parish church, called for the death of peninsular Spaniards and the restoration of lands to indigenous communities, transforming a Creole political movement into a racial and social war. The composition of Hidalgo's forces reflected the social tensions that Spanish colonial policy had created through centuries of racial discrimination and economic exploitation. The initial band of approximately 600 followers included indigenous peasants from surrounding villages, mestizo artisans and small farmers, and a small number of Creole intellectuals who supported the independence cause. Within 2 weeks, the movement had attracted over 25,000 supporters, including miners from Guanajuato, agricultural workers from the Bajío region, and urban poor from provincial cities. The lack of military training and equipment among these forces was compensated by their numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of local terrain. The capture of Guanajuato on September 28, 1810, demonstrated both the popular support for Hidalgo's movement and the violent character that the independence struggle would assume. The city's Spanish and Creole elite, numbering approximately 500 people, took refuge in the Alcántara de Granaditas, a massive stone granary that served as an improvised fortress. The indigenous and mestizo attackers, led by one José Martínez, known as El Pipola, stormed the building after setting fire to its wooden doors. The massacre that followed killed virtually all the defenders and established Hidalgo's reputation as a leader of social revolution rather than merely political independence. The seizure of the city's treasury, containing over 400,000 pesos, provided the insurgent movement with financial resources while demonstrating the vulnerability of Spanish colonial defenses. The march toward Mexico City revealed the strategic limitations of Hidalgo's movement and the effectiveness of Spanish military response when properly organized. The insurgent army, swollen to over 80,000 followers by October 1810, lacked the discipline and equipment necessary for sustained military operations against trained Spanish forces. The Spanish commander, Felix Maria Calleja, a veteran of European campaigns with extensive experience in colonial administration, organized a defense based on fortified positions and systematic use of artillery against massed indigenous attacks. The Battle of Monte de las Cruces on October 30, 1810, where Hidalgo's forces defeated a Spanish army of 2,500 men, demonstrated insurgent numerical superiority, but also revealed their inability to exploit tactical victories through coordinated pursuit and occupation of strategic positions. Hidalgo's decision to retreat from the approaches to Mexico City rather than assault the capital represented a crucial strategic error that allowed Spanish forces to reorganize and launch effective counterattacks. The insurgent leader's reluctance to attack Mexico City reflected both his awareness of his force's military limitations and his concern about the social consequences of unleashing indigenous and mestizo anger against the colonial capital's Spanish and Creole population. The retreat provided Calleja with the opportunity to concentrate Spanish forces and implement the systematic campaign that would gradually reduce insurgent-controlled territory throughout central Mexico. The capture and execution of Hidalgo on July 30, 1811, eliminated the charismatic leadership that had united diverse social groups in opposition to Spanish rule, but failed to suppress the independence movement that had spread throughout New Spain. José María Morelos, a mestizo priest who had served as Hidalgo's lieutenant in southern Mexico, assumed leadership of the insurgent cause and implemented more effective military and political strategies. Morelos' background as a muleteer before entering the priesthood provided him with extensive knowledge of Mexican geography and commercial networks, while his theological education enabled him to articulate a coherent political program that appealed to Creole intellectuals as well as popular masses. The Congress of Chilpancingo, convened by Morelos on September 14, 1813, represented the most sophisticated attempt to establish legitimate government institutions during the Mexican independence struggle. The Congress, composed of representatives from insurgent-controlled territories, issued the Sentiments of the Nation, a document that declared Mexican independence, established Catholic Christianity as the official religion, and proclaimed the equality of all citizens regardless of race or social origin. The constitutional provisions drafted by the Congress eliminated the legal distinctions between peninsular Spaniards, Creoles, mestizos, and indigenous peoples that had formed the foundation of colonial social hierarchy. The Congress's decision to offer the Mexican crown to Ferdinand VII, contingent upon his acceptance of constitutional limitations, demonstrated the moderate character of Creole political aspirations even in the midst of social revolution. The Spanish reconquest of insurgent territories proceeded systematically under Calleja's direction, employing tactics that combined military pressure with political concessions designed to divide the independence movement. The Spanish strategy focused on isolating insurgent leaders from their popular support through offers of amnesty to followers who abandoned the independence cause, while simultaneously implementing scorched earth policies that denied insurgent forces access to food and supplies. The establishment of fortified towns throughout central Mexico provided Spanish forces with secure bases for operations while protecting loyalist populations from insurgent attacks. The use of indigenous and mestizo auxiliaries in Spanish forces demonstrated the complex racial dynamics of the independence struggle, as colonial authorities successfully recruited supporters from the same social groups that provided the insurgent movements with their mass base. The execution of Morelos on December 22, 1815 marked the effective end of the first phase of Mexican independence struggle and established Spanish control over most of the territory that had been in insurgent hands since 1810. The capture of Morelos near Temalaca, while attempting to escort the remnants of the Congress of Chilpancingo to safety, eliminated the last effective insurgent leadership and scattered the remaining independence forces into isolated guerrilla bands. The Spanish military tribunals that tried captured insurgent leaders implemented systematic policies of execution and property confiscation, designed to eliminate any possibility of renewed organized resistance. The restoration of Spanish authority appeared complete by 1816, with only scattered guerrilla activity continuing in remote mountain regions of southern Mexico. The liberal revolution in Spain that began on January 1, 1820, with Rafael del Riego's military uprising in Andalusia, created new political opportunities for Mexican independence by forcing Ferdinand VII to accept constitutional limitations on royal authority. The restoration of the Constitution of 1812 eliminated the absolute monarchy that had governed Spain since Ferdinand's return from French captivity, while establishing representative government and guaranteeing individual rights that colonial authorities had systematically violated during the independence wars. The constitutional requirement that Spanish territories elect representatives to the Cortes provided Creole leaders with legal avenues for political participation that had been denied during the previous decade of military rule. Agustín de Iturbide's decision to embrace the independence cause in February 1821 reflected the changing political calculations that the Spanish liberal revolution had created among conservative Creole and peninsular elites. Iturbide, who had served as a royalist commander during the independence wars and had been instrumental in defeating Morelos, recognized that Spanish liberalism posed a greater threat to traditional colonial social hierarchies than Mexican independence under conservative leadership. The Plan of Iguala, proclaimed on February 24, 1821, offered a program that appealed to conservative elements throughout Mexican society by guaranteeing the privileges of the Catholic Church, maintaining existing social distinctions, and establishing a constitutional monarchy that would preserve traditional authority structures. The Army of the Three Guarantees, organized by Iturbide to implement the Plan of Iguala, achieved rapid success throughout Mexico by appealing to war-weary populations and offering Spanish officials opportunities to retain their positions under the new government. The Army's name reflected its commitment to independence, religion, and union among all social groups, while its composition included former insurgent leaders like Vicente Guerrero, alongside royalist officers who had fought against the independence movement. The systematic nature of Iturbide's campaign, which avoided the social violence that had characterized earlier independence movements, attracted support from Spanish and Creole elites who had opposed Hidalgo and Morelos, but found Mexican independence preferable to Spanish liberalism. The Treaty of Córdoba, signed on August 24, 1821, between Iturbide and Spanish Viceroy Juan O'Donoghue, formally recognized Mexican independence and established the constitutional framework for the new nation. The treaty's provisions reflected the conservative character of Iturbide's movement by offering the Mexican crown to Ferdinand VII, or another member of the Spanish royal family, while guaranteeing the rights of Spanish residents and maintaining the privileges of the Catholic Church. The Spanish government's subsequent repudiation of the treaty, based on O'Donoghue's lack of authority to negotiate Mexican independence, eliminated the possibility of peaceful transition, but could not prevent the collapse of Spanish authority that had already occurred throughout most of Mexican territory. The independence of Mexico in September 1821 removed the most valuable territory from the Spanish Empire and demonstrated the effectiveness of conservative independence movements that appealed to elite interests rather than popular revolution. The loss of Mexican silver mines, which had provided the foundation of Spanish imperial finances for 3 centuries, eliminated Spain's ability to maintain effective control over its remaining American territories. The Mexican independence also established a precedent for negotiated independence that would influence subsequent independence movements throughout Spanish America, as Creole leaders recognized that conservative political programs could achieve independence without triggering the social upheaval that had characterized earlier revolutionary movements. The independence movements in South America followed different patterns, but reflected similar tensions between Creole political aspirations and Spanish determination to maintain imperial control. The establishment of the first autonomous junta in Caracas on April 19, 1810 initiated a decade of warfare that would eventually encompass all of northern South America. The junta's initial declaration of loyalty to Ferdinand VII, while assuming governmental authority in Venezuela, reflected the same constitutional reasoning that had motivated independence movements throughout Spanish America. The participation of prominent Creole families, including the Bolívars, Rebus, and toros, provided the movement with social legitimacy and financial resources, while the exclusion of partisan slaves from political participation maintained the racial hierarchies that had characterized colonial society. The First Republic of Venezuela, established in 1811, represented the most radical political experiment in early Spanish-American independence movements through its adoption of federalism and explicit rejection of Spanish sovereignty. The Venezuelan Constitution, drafted by a Congress dominated by Creole lawyers and intellectuals, established a federal system that granted extensive autonomy to provincial governments while maintaining national unity through a weak central government. The Constitution's provisions for gradual slave emancipation and the extension of political rights to free partis represented significant departures from colonial social arrangements. But these reforms also created opposition among conservative Creole elements who feared social revolution. The collapse of the First Republic in 1812 demonstrated the military and political challenges that independence movements faced when confronted with determined Spanish resistance and internal social divisions. The Spanish Reconquest, led by Domingo de Monteverde with approximately 4,000 troops, exploited Venezuelan internal divisions by appealing to slave and pardo populations who had been excluded from Republican political participation. The earthquake of March 26, 1812, which destroyed much of Caracas and killed over 10,000 people, provided Spanish authorities with propaganda opportunities by presenting the natural disaster as divine punishment for rebellion against legitimate authority. The surrender of Francisco de Miranda on July 25, 1812, eliminated the most experienced military leader of the independence movement and allowed Spanish forces to occupy most of Venezuelan territory with minimal resistance. Simón Bolívar's emergence as the dominant leader of South American independence reflected both his personal capabilities and the changing strategic situation that Spanish liberal revolution had created. Bolívar's education in Europe, where he had witnessed the Napoleonic Wars and studied Enlightenment political theory, provided him with intellectual frameworks for understanding the independence struggle as part of broader Atlantic revolutionary movements. His family's wealth, derived from cacao plantations and commercial investments, gave him financial independence that allowed him to dedicate himself entirely to the independence cause without requiring payment or political appointments. The combination of intellectual sophistication, personal wealth, and military experience that Bolívar possessed was rare among Creole leaders and essential for the sustained leadership that the independence struggle required. The admirable campaign of 1813, which restored Venezuelan independence and established Bolívar's military reputation, demonstrated the effectiveness of mobile warfare tactics adapted to South American geographical conditions. Bolívar's march from New Granada to Caracas, covering over 1,000 miles in 75 days with fewer than 1,000 men, succeeded through rapid movement that prevented Spanish forces from concentrating against his small army. The systematic elimination of Spanish garrisons at Mérida, Trujillo, and other strategic points provided Bolívar with additional troops and supplies, while demonstrating Republican military effectiveness to wavering populations. The triumphant entry into Caracas on August 6, 1813, restored Republican government and established Bolívar's position as the liberator of Venezuela. The Second Republic of Venezuela, established under Bolívar's leadership in 1813, faced more severe challenges than its predecessor due to the intensification of Spanish resistance and the emergence of popular royalist movements among the Llanero population. José Tomás Boves, a Spanish merchant who had established himself among the cattle herders of the Venezuelan plains, organized a royalist army that appealed to racial resentments and social grievances that Republican policies had failed to address. The Llanero cavalry, composed primarily of mestizo and mulatto horsemen with extensive experience in cattle herding, possessed superior mobility and knowledge of local terrain that made them formidable opponents for Republican forces trained in European military tactics. The Battle of La Puerta on June 15, 1814, where Boves' Llanero cavalry destroyed a Republican army of 3,000 men, demonstrated the military effectiveness of popular royalist movements and forced Bolívar to abandon Caracas for the second time. The The systematic destruction of Republican forces throughout Venezuela during 1814 eliminated most of the Creole leadership that had supported independence since 1810, while the massacre of Republican prisoners and civilians created a legacy of violence that would influence Venezuelan politics for generations. The Spanish Restoration appeared complete by the end of 1814, with Republican forces reduced to isolated guerrilla bands operating from Caribbean islands and remote mountain regions. The expedition of Pablo Murillo, who arrived in Venezuela in April 1815 with 10,000 Spanish troops, represented the largest military effort that Spain mounted to suppress American independence movements. Murillo's forces, composed of veterans from the Peninsular War against Napoleon, possessed superior training and equipment compared to the colonial militias that had previously conducted Spanish military operations in America. The systematic campaign that Murillo implemented throughout Venezuela and New Granada eliminated most remaining Republican resistance while establishing Spanish control over territories that had been in insurgent hands for several years. The execution of the Republican leaders, including Manuel Piar and Francisco José de Caldas, demonstrated Spanish determination to prevent any revival of independence movements through the elimination of potential leadership. The Congress of Angostura, convened by Bolívar on February 15, 1819, represented the most sophisticated attempt to establish legitimate Republican government institutions during the South American independence struggle. The Congress, composed of representatives from areas under Republican control, adopted a constitution that established a strong central government while guaranteeing individual rights and providing for the gradual abolition of slavery. Bolívar's address to the Congress, which analyzed the political and social conditions that independence movements faced, demonstrated his understanding of the complex relationship between military success and political legitimacy. The creation of Gran Colombia, uniting Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador under a single government, provided the territorial and demographic foundation necessary for sustained resistance against Spanish reconquest efforts. The Battle of Boyaca on August 7, 1819, marked the decisive turning point in the South American independence struggle and established Republican control over New Granada. Bolívar's army of 2,850 men, including British and Irish volunteers who had joined the independence cause, defeated a Spanish force of 2,700 troops commanded by José María Barrero. The Republican victory, achieved through superior tactical coordination and the effective use of British military advisors, eliminated Spanish control over the Magdalena River Valley and opened the route to Bogotá. The capture of Viceroy Juan Samano's archive and treasury provided Republicans with intelligence about Spanish military plans while eliminating the financial resources that had supported royalist operations throughout northern South America. José de San Martin's strategy for liberating Peru through the invasion of Chile represented a fundamentally different approach to independence warfare that emphasized professional military organization over popular mobilization. San Martin's experience as a Spanish officer in European campaigns had convinced him that independence could be achieved only through disciplined armies capable of defeating Spanish forces in conventional warfare. The Army of the Andes, organized at Mendoza between 1814 and 1817, included approximately 4,000 men trained according to European military standards and equipped with artillery and supplies transported across the Andes through one of the most difficult logistical operations in military history. The crossing of the Andes in January 1817 demonstrated the organizational capabilities that San Martin had developed through years of careful preparation and the dedication of his officers and men to the independence cause. The Army's march across 6 different mountain passes, coordinated to confuse intelligence about the main attack route, required the transportation of 10,000 mules, 1,500 horses and 700 cattle along with artillery pieces and supplies for a month-long campaign. The successful concentration of Republican forces at Chacabuco, despite the dispersion required for the mountain crossing, revealed the professional competence that distinguished San Martin's military organization from the improvised armies that had characterized earlier independence movements. The Battle of Chacabuco on February 12, 1817, established Republican control over central Chile and demonstrated the effectiveness of San Martin's military reforms. The Spanish army of 2,500 men, commanded by Rafael Maroto, occupied strong defensive positions that should have provided significant advantages against attacking forces. The Republican victory, achieved through coordinated infantry and cavalry attacks that exploited weaknesses in Spanish deployment, eliminated effective Spanish resistance throughout central Chile while capturing substantial quantities of artillery and supplies. The liberation of Santiago on February 14, 1817 completed the conquest of Chile and provided Republicans with a secure base necessary for subsequent operations against Peru. The establishment of the Chilean squadron under Lord Thomas Cochrane's command provided Republicans with the naval capabilities necessary for challenging Spanish control of the Pacific Ocean. Cochrane, a former British naval officer with extensive experience in European warfare, organized a fleet of 8 vessels that included both captured Spanish ships and vessels purchased from British and American merchants. The squadron's operations against Spanish shipping and coastal installations eliminated Spanish naval supremacy along the Pacific coast while providing Republicans with intelligence about Spanish military preparations in Peru. The capture of the Spanish frigate Esmeralda on November 5, 1820 demonstrated Republican naval capabilities and provided additional vessels for the invasion of Peru. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formally ended Spanish colonial presence in the Americas and marked the emergence of the United States as a global power. But the path to this moment had been shaped by 73 years of Spanish attempts to maintain control over their remaining Caribbean and Pacific territories through a combination of military force, limited political reforms, and economic exploitation. The loss of the South American mainland had reduced the Spanish Empire to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, territories that generated substantial revenues but required constant military expenditure to suppress independence movements that drew inspiration from the successful liberation of Mexico, Gran Colombia, and the other former Spanish colonies. Cuba's economic transformation during the 19th century created the wealth that made the island Spain's most valuable remaining colony, while simultaneously generating the social tensions that would fuel persistent independence movements. The expansion of sugar production, facilitated by the introduction of steam-powered mills and railroad transportation, increased Cuban sugar exports from 40,000 tons in 1825 to over 500,000 tons by 1860. The sugar boom concentrated land ownership in the hands of approximately 1,500 plantation owners, many of whom were peninsular Spaniards or recent immigrants from the Canary Islands, while displacing thousands of small farmers who had previously cultivated tobacco and subsistence crops. The Ingenio Flor de Cuba, established near Matanzas in 1837, encompassed 12,000 acres and employed over 800 enslaved workers, representing the scale of investment that characterized the most successful sugar operations. The expansion of Cuban sugar production required a massive increase in the importation of enslaved Africans, despite British pressure to end the slave trade and growing international opposition to slavery. Spanish authorities issued over 200 licenses for slave importation between 1835 and 1845, authorizing the transport of approximately 15,000 Africans annually to Cuban plantations. The slave ships, operating under Spanish, Portuguese, and Brazilian flags, delivered their human cargo to isolated beaches along the Cuban coast, where plantation agents purchased slaves for prices ranging from 400 to 600 pesos each. The mortality rate during the Middle Passage remained approximately 15%, while the working conditions on sugar plantations resulted in additional deaths that required constant replacement of the labor force. The development of railroad networks throughout Cuba during the 1840s and 1850s revolutionized the transportation of sugar and other agricultural products while demonstrating Spanish commitment to modernizing their colonial infrastructure. The Havana-Guinness Railroad, completed in 1838, reduced the transportation time for sugar from the interior plantations to the port of Havana from several weeks to less than 2 days. The construction of over 400 miles of railroad track by 1860 required substantial capital investment from Spanish and British investors, while creating employment for thousands of workers including free blacks, Chinese indentured laborers, and Spanish immigrants. The railroad companies, granted extensive land concessions and tax exemptions by Spanish authorities, generated profits that attracted additional European investment in Cuban economic development. The Chinese coolie trade, which brought approximately 125,000 Chinese laborers between 1847 and 1874, represented Spanish attempts to address labor shortages while reducing dependence on enslaved African workers. The Chinese workers, bound by 8-year contracts that paid wages of 4 pesos per month, worked alongside enslaved Africans in sugar plantations, tobacco factories, and railroad construction projects. The working conditions for Chinese laborers differed little from slavery, with high mortality rates, physical punishment, and restrictions on movement that violated the terms of their contracts. The Spanish authorities' failure to enforce labor protections for Chinese workers demonstrated their prioritization of economic production over humanitarian concerns. The tobacco industry, centered in the Vuelta a Bajo region of western Cuba, developed into a sophisticated agricultural and manufacturing sector that employed both enslaved and free workers in cultivation, processing, and cigar manufacturing. The Vegas small tobacco farms, typically encompassing 50 to 100 acres, produced the high-quality leaf tobacco that commanded premium prices in European and American markets. The Patagas cigar factory, established in Havana in 1845, employed over 300 workers in the production of hand-rolled cigars that were exported throughout Europe and the Americas. The skilled nature of cigar manufacturing created opportunities for free workers, including Spanish immigrants and free people of color, to earn wages that exceeded those available in agricultural labor. The Spanish colonial administration's response to growing Cuban prosperity included increased taxation and tighter political control that generated resentment among Creole planters and merchants, who demanded greater autonomy in managing their economic affairs. The Captain General of Cuba, appointed directly by Madrid with extensive military and civilian authority, governed through a system of appointed officials who reported to Spanish authorities rather than local interests. The exclusion of Cubans from significant governmental positions, combined with discriminatory taxation that favored peninsular merchants, created political grievances that paralleled the economic tensions generated by Spanish commercial monopolies. The conspiracy of the Escalera in 1844 revealed the extent of slave resistance to plantation conditions and Spanish fears of racial revolution that might replicate the Haitian experience. Spanish authorities, led by Captain General Leopoldo O'Donnell, conducted extensive investigations that resulted in the arrest of over 3,000 people, including enslaved Africans, free people of color, and white abolitionists. The torture and execution of suspected conspirators, including the poet Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, known as Placido, demonstrated Spanish determination to suppress any challenge to racial hierarchy that underpinned colonial society. The conspiracy's suppression eliminated much of the free black leadership that had emerged in Cuban cities, while reinforcing Spanish military control over the island. The 10 Years' War, which began on October 10, 1868, with Carlos Manuel de Chespidz's declaration of independence at his sugar plantation La de Masagua, represented the first sustained Cuban attempt to achieve independence through armed resistance. Chespidz, a lawyer and plantation owner educated in Spain, freed his 30 slaves and called upon other Cubans to join the struggle for independence from Spanish rule. The initial rebel force of approximately 150 men, armed with hunting rifles and machetes, grew rapidly as news of the uprising spread throughout the eastern provinces of Cuba. The rebels' decision to offer freedom to enslaved Africans who joined their cause attracted thousands of supporters, while simultaneously alarming conservative Creoles who feared social revolution. The Spanish military response to the Cuban Rebellion involved the deployment of over 100,000 troops, making it one of the largest military operations in Spanish colonial history. General Domingo Dulce, appointed Captain General in 1869, implemented a strategy that combined military operations against rebel forces with political reforms designed to divide the independence movement. The Spanish forces, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, possessed significant advantages in conventional warfare, but struggled to combat the guerrilla tactics that Cuban rebels employed in the island's mountainous interior. The use of reconcentration policies, which forced rural populations into fortified towns, aimed to deny rebels access to supplies and intelligence, while protecting Spanish loyalists from rebel attacks. The leadership of the Cuban independence movement reflected the complex social dynamics that characterized 19th-century colonial society. Máximo Gómez, a Dominican-born veteran of Spanish military service, provided the rebels with professional military expertise and organizational capabilities that transformed scattered insurgent bands into an effective fighting force. Gómez's implementation of systematic guerrilla warfare, including the destruction of sugar plantations and railroad infrastructure, aimed to make Spanish colonial rule economically unsustainable while demonstrating rebel capacity to operate throughout Cuban territory. The participation of Antonio Maceo, a mulatto general who commanded significant support among Afro-Cuban populations, demonstrated the multiracial character of the independence movement while challenging Spanish attempts to characterize the rebellion as a race war. The Pact of Zanjan, signed on February 10, 1878, ended the 10 Years' War through Spanish concessions that granted limited political reforms while maintaining colonial control over Cuba. The agreement provided amnesty for Cuban rebels, granted representation in the Spanish Cortes, and promised the gradual abolition of slavery, but failed to address the fundamental issues of Cuban autonomy and economic independence that had motivated the rebellion. The Spanish commitment to implement these reforms gradually, combined with continued military occupation and restrictive political controls, satisfied neither Cuban independence advocates nor Spanish colonial interests. The failure of many prominent rebel leaders, including Antonio Maceo, to accept the Zanjan Agreement indicated the temporary nature of the peace settlement. The abolition of slavery in Cuba, implemented gradually between 1880 and 1886, eliminated the institution that had provided the foundation for Spanish colonial prosperity while creating new forms of labor control that maintained economic exploitation. The Patronato system, established in 1880, required former slaves to work for their former masters for 8 years in exchange for wages and basic necessities. The system's provisions, which restricted worker mobility and maintained disciplinary authority in the hands of former slaveholders, differed little from slavery in practical terms. The complete abolition of slavery in 1886 created a free labor market that included approximately 200,000 former slaves, but the lack of land redistribution or educational opportunities limited their economic prospects. The economic depression that affected Cuba during the 1880s and 1890s, caused by declining sugar prices and increasing competition from European beet sugar, created conditions that favored renewed independence movements. The McKinley Tariff of 1890, which eliminated preferential treatment for Cuban sugar in American markets, reduced Cuban sugar exports by 40% and created widespread unemployment among agricultural workers. The Spanish government's response to the economic crisis included increased taxation and reduced public spending, policies that intensified Cuban resentment of colonial rule, while providing independence advocates with additional grievances to exploit in their political organizing. José Martí's emergence as the intellectual leader of Cuban independence reflected the evolution of Cuban nationalism from the regional rebellions of the 1860s and 1870s to a sophisticated political movement with international support and clear ideological foundations. Martí, a lawyer and journalist who had been exiled from Cuba for his political activities, established the Cuban Revolutionary Party in New York in 1892 with the explicit goal of achieving Cuban independence through coordinated military and political action. The party's program, outlined in Martí's writings and speeches, emphasized the creation of a democratic republic that would guarantee racial equality and social justice while maintaining Cuba's cultural identity and economic independence. The organizational structure that Martí created for the Cuban Revolutionary Party demonstrated his understanding of the international dimensions of the independence struggle and the need for sustained financial and political support from Cuban exiles and sympathetic Americans. The party's clubs, established in New York, Tampa, Key West, and other cities with significant Cuban populations, collected funds for arms purchases while conducting propaganda campaigns designed to build American support for Cuban independence. The party's newspaper, Patria, published in New York from 1892 to 1898, provided Cuban exiles with information about conditions in Cuba while articulating the intellectual foundations of Cuban nationalism for American and international audiences. The Cuban War of Independence, which began on February 24, 1895, with simultaneous uprisings in eastern and central Cuba, represented the culmination of Martí's organizational efforts and the most serious challenge to Spanish colonial rule since the conquest. The rebels' initial forces, numbering approximately 3,000 men armed with rifles smuggled from the United States, quickly expanded as news of the uprising spread throughout rural Cuba. The death of Martí at the Battle of Dos Rios on May 19, 1895, eliminated the movement's prominent intellectual leader, but failed to suppress the rebellion that had gained momentum throughout the island. The assumption of military leadership by Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo, veterans of the 10 Years' War, provided the rebels with experienced commanders who understood both Spanish military capabilities and the guerrilla tactics necessary for successful resistance. The Spanish response to the 1895 uprising involved the deployment of over 200,000 troops, representing the largest military commitment that Spain had made to any colonial territory. General Arsenio Martínez Campos, the Spanish commander who had negotiated the Pact of Zanjan, initially attempted to suppress the rebellion through conventional military operations combined with political negotiations. The failure of this approach, demonstrated by the rebels' ability to extend their operations throughout central and western Cuba, led to Martínez Campos' replacement by General Valeriano Weyler in February 1896. Weyler's appointment marked a fundamental shift in Spanish strategy toward the harsh reconcentration policies that would characterize the final phase of Spanish colonial rule. The reconcentration policy implemented by General Weyler represented the most systematic attempt to suppress Cuban independence through the control of civilian populations and the denial of support to rebel forces. The policy required rural populations to relocate to fortified towns where Spanish authorities could monitor their activities and prevent assistance to rebel forces. The implementation of reconcentration affected approximately 400,000 people, roughly 1/4 of Cuba's population, who were forced to abandon their homes and agricultural activities. The overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in the reconcentration camps, combined with inadequate food supplies and medical care, resulted in mortality rates that exceeded 20% in many locations. The international reaction to Spanish reconcentration policies, particularly in the United States, created diplomatic pressure that complicated Spanish efforts to suppress the Cuban rebellion. American newspapers, led by William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, published detailed accounts of Spanish atrocities and Cuban suffering that generated public sympathy for the independence cause. The American press coverage, which emphasized Spanish brutality while romanticizing Cuban resistance, created political pressure for American intervention that Spanish authorities proved unable to counteract through diplomatic means. The Spanish government's attempts to justify reconcentration as a necessary military measure failed to address American concerns about humanitarian conditions in Cuba. The death of Antonio Maceo on December 7, 1896, in a Spanish ambush near Havana eliminated the most prominent Afro-Cuban leader and demonstrated Spanish tactical successes in targeting rebel commanders. Maceo's death, along with that of his aide Francisco Gómez Toro, son of Máximo Gómez, deprived the independence movement of charismatic leadership that had attracted significant support among Cuba's black population. The Spanish authorities' decision to display Maceo's body publicly in Havana aimed to demonstrate the effectiveness of their military operations while demoralizing rebel supporters. However, the martyrdom of Maceo strengthened Cuban nationalist mythology, while failing to suppress the rebellion that continued under other leaders. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, transformed the Cuban independence struggle into an international crisis that would determine the of the Spanish Empire. The battleship, which had been sent to Havana to protect American citizens and interests during the Cuban Rebellion, exploded at 9:40 p.m., killing 266 American sailors and officers. The cause of the explosion remained unclear, with Spanish authorities maintaining that an internal accident had caused the disaster, while American investigators concluded that an external mine had destroyed the vessel. The American press immediately blamed Spain for the explosion, using the incident to justify calls for military intervention in Cuba. The Spanish government's attempts to avoid war with the United States through diplomatic concessions and the recall of General Weyler demonstrated Spanish awareness of their military limitations and the impossibility of simultaneously fighting Cuban rebels and American forces. The appointment of General Ramon Blanco as Captain General of Cuba in October 1897, along with the promise of autonomy for Cuba, represented Spanish efforts to address American concerns while maintaining colonial control. The Autonomy Decree, issued on November 25, 1897, granted Cuba limited self-government while preserving Spanish sovereignty and military control. The reforms, however, satisfied neither Cuban independence advocates nor American demands for complete Spanish withdrawal from Cuba. The American declaration of war on April 25, 1898, marked the beginning of the Spanish-American War and the final phase of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas. The American ultimatum, demanding Spanish withdrawal from Cuba and recognition of Cuban independence, represented terms that no Spanish government could accept without acknowledging the complete failure of colonial policy. The Spanish decision to fight rather than accept American demands reflected both national pride and the political impossibility of voluntarily abandoning the empire's most valuable remaining territories. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera, departed the Cape Verde Islands on April 29, 1898, with 4 armored cruisers and 3 destroyers, representing the primary Spanish naval force available for operations in American waters. The Battle of Manila Bay on May 1, 1898, demonstrated American naval superiority and eliminated Spanish naval power in the Pacific within hours of the war's beginning. Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron, comprising 4 cruisers and 2 gunboats, attacked the Spanish fleet commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoyo in Manila Bay at dawn. The Spanish fleet, consisting of 7 vessels including the flagship Reina Cristina, occupied positions near the Cavite naval base that provided some protection from shore batteries. The American attack, delivered in systematic passes that brought superior firepower to bear against each Spanish vessel, resulted in the destruction or capture of the entire Spanish fleet within 7 hours. The Spanish casualties exceeded 380 killed and wounded, while American losses totaled 8 wounded, demonstrating the technological superiority of American naval gunnery and ship design. The Siege of Santiago de Cuba, which began with the American landing at Daiquiri on June 22, 1898, represented the primary American military operation in Cuba and the decisive campaign of the Spanish-American War. The American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General William Shafter, included approximately 17,000 troops organized in the 5th Army Corps, along with volunteer units including the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Leonard Wood and Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. The Spanish garrison of Santiago, numbering approximately 12,000 troops under General Arsenio Linares, occupied strong defensive positions in the hills surrounding the city, including the fortified village of El Cani and the San Juan Heights that dominated the approaches to Santiago. The Battle of Las Guasimas on June 24, 1898, provided American forces with their first combat experience against Spanish troops and demonstrated the effectiveness of Spanish defensive tactics when properly implemented. The Spanish force of approximately 1,500 men, commanded by General Antero Rubin, occupied prepared positions that took advantage of the dense tropical vegetation to conceal their movements while providing clear fields of fire against advancing American troops. The American attack, conducted by portions of the 1st and 10th Cavalry Regiments, along with the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, succeeded in driving Spanish forces from their positions, but at a cost of 16 killed and 52 wounded. The Spanish withdrawal, conducted in good order with minimal casualties, indicated their ability to conduct effective delaying actions against superior American forces. The battles of El Cani and San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898, marked the climactic engagements of the Santiago campaign and demonstrated both American tactical capabilities and the limitations of Spanish defensive preparations. The assault on El Cani, conducted by General Henry Lawton's 2nd Division, encountered stronger Spanish resistance than anticipated, with approximately 520 Spanish troops under General Joaquin Vara del Rey holding fortified positions for over 10 hours against attacks by 6,600 American soldiers. The Spanish defense, characterized by accurate rifle fire and effective use of defensive positions, inflicted 81 American casualties while suffering 235 killed and wounded before the position finally fell. The death of General Vara del Rey, killed while directing the defense of his position, exemplified the professional competence of Spanish military leadership despite inadequate resources and overwhelming enemy superiority. The assault on San Juan Hill, conducted simultaneously with the El Cani attack, involved approximately 8,000 American troops attacking Spanish positions defended by fewer than 800 soldiers. The Spanish fortifications, consisting of trenches and blockhouses positioned on commanding terrain, provided excellent defensive positions that should have enabled the garrison to inflict heavy casualties on attacking forces. The American attack, supported by artillery fire and conducted by regular army units along with volunteer regiments, succeeded in capturing the Spanish positions through coordinated assaults that exploited weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. The Spanish casualties, totaling approximately 200 killed and wounded, reflected the effectiveness of their defensive fire, while American losses of 144 killed and 1,024 wounded demonstrated the cost of frontal assaults against prepared positions. The naval battle of Santiago on July 3, 1898 eliminated Spanish naval power in the Caribbean and sealed the fate of the Spanish garrison at Santiago de Cuba. Admiral Cervera's squadron, trapped in Santiago harbor by the American blockade, attempted to break out to sea on the morning of July 3, 1898 in a desperate effort to avoid capture or destruction. The Spanish fleet, consisting of 4 armored cruisers and 2 destroyers, faced the American North Atlantic Squadron commanded by Rear Admiral William Sampson and Commodore Winfield Schley. The American fleet, including 4 battleships and 2 armored cruisers, possessed overwhelming superiority in firepower and armor protection that made the outcome of any engagement virtually certain. The destruction of the Spanish fleet proceeded systematically as American vessels concentrated their fire on each Spanish ship in turn, preventing coordinated Spanish resistance and ensuring the destruction of Cervera's entire squadron. The flagship Infanta Maria Teresa, commanded by Admiral Cervera, suffered heavy damage within the first hour of combat and was forced to beach near Santiago to prevent sinking. The Vizcaya, Cristobal Colon, and Almirante Oquendo met similar fates as American gunfire systematically destroyed their fighting capability and forced them to run aground along the Cuban coast. The Spanish casualties totaled 323 killed and 151 wounded, while American losses amounted to 1 killed and 10 wounded, demonstrating the technological superiority that had characterized American naval operations throughout the war. The surrender of Santiago on July 17, 1898, following 2 weeks of siege operations, eliminated the last significant Spanish military force in Cuba and ensured American victory in the Caribbean theater. General José Toral, who had assumed command following General Linares' wounding during the San Juan Hill battle, negotiated surrender terms that allowed Spanish troops to return to Spain while transferring control of eastern Cuba to American forces. The Spanish garrison, numbering approximately 24,000 troops, including reinforcements that had arrived during the siege, laid down their arms in ceremonies that marked the end of over 400 years of Spanish rule in Cuba. The Treaty of Paris negotiations, conducted in the French capital from October 1 to December 10, 1898, revealed the extent of Spanish imperial collapse and the emergence of the United States as a global power with overseas territories spanning from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The Spanish delegation, led by Eugenio Montero Rios, arrived in Paris with instructions to minimize territorial losses while preserving Spanish sovereignty over the Philippines if possible. The American commissioners, headed by former Secretary of State William Day, possessed clear instructions from President William McKinley to secure Cuban independence, acquire Puerto Rico and Guam, and negotiate the purchase of the Philippines for $20 million. The Spanish negotiating position, weakened by military defeats and the complete destruction of their naval forces, provided little leverage for resisting American territorial demands. The cession of the Philippines to the United States eliminated Spanish control over territories that had been governed from Madrid for 333 years and encompassed over 7,000 islands, with a population exceeding 7 million people. The Spanish colonial administration in Manila, established in 1571, had created the longest-lasting European colonial system in Asia, surviving Dutch competition, British occupation during the 7 Years' War, and persistent indigenous resistance throughout the 19th century. The loss of the Philippines deprived Spain of the Asian territories that had connected the Spanish Empire to the China trade and provided the western terminus of the Manila-Acapulco galleon route that had transported Asian goods to the Americas for 2.5 centuries. The transfer of Puerto Rico to American sovereignty represented the loss of Spain's oldest Caribbean colony and eliminated Spanish control over territories that had served as the gateway to the Spanish Empire since Columbus' second voyage in 1493. The island's strategic position in the Caribbean, combined with its developed agricultural economy based on sugar and coffee production, had made Puerto Rico a valuable component of the Spanish colonial system despite its relatively small size and population of approximately 950,000 inhabitants. The Spanish fortifications at San Juan, constructed during the 16th and 17th centuries to defend against foreign attack, had successfully resisted British and Dutch assaults, but proved irrelevant against American naval superiority and amphibious assault capabilities. The cession of Guam to the United States eliminated Spanish control over the Mariana Islands and ended Spanish presence in the Pacific Ocean outside of the Philippines. The Spanish colonization of Guam, beginning with Miguel López de Legazpi's expedition in 1565, had established the refueling station that enabled Spanish galleons to complete the trans-Pacific voyage between the Philippines and Mexico. The island's indigenous Chamorro population, numbering approximately 9,000 people by 1898, had been reduced from an estimated 50,000 inhabitants at the time of Spanish contact through disease, warfare, and cultural disruption that paralleled the demographic catastrophe that had affected indigenous populations throughout the Spanish Empire. The Spanish retention of Cuba's independence, rather than direct American annexation, reflected American political calculations and Cuban resistance to foreign rule, but eliminated Spanish sovereignty over the island that had generated more revenue than any other Spanish colony during the 19th century. The Cuban economy, based on sugar production that had employed over 200,000 enslaved workers before abolition in 1886, had provided Spanish authorities with annual revenues exceeding 15 million pesos during the 1890s. The loss of Cuban customs duties, taxation on sugar exports, and profits from the tobacco monopoly eliminated the primary source of income that had enabled Spain to maintain colonial administrations in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. The Spanish colonial empire's reduction to Spanish Morocco and Equatorial Guinea represented the remnants of imperial territories that had once encompassed 4 continents and generated the wealth that made Spain the dominant European power during the 16th and 17th centuries. Spanish Morocco, established through the occupation of coastal enclaves including Ceuta, Melilla, and Tetuan, provided Spain with strategic positions controlling access to the Mediterranean, but generated limited economic benefits while requiring constant military expenditure to suppress indigenous resistance. The Spanish protectorate over northern Morocco, established in 1912 following the Treaty of Fez, encompassed approximately 20,000 square kilometers with a population of 1.5 million inhabitants who had never accepted Spanish sovereignty and maintained persistent resistance to colonial rule. The Rift War, which began in 1920 with Abdelkrim's uprising against Spanish colonial authority, demonstrated the continuing challenges that Spain faced in maintaining control over territories that generated limited economic benefits while requiring substantial military expenditure. The Spanish garrison in Morocco, numbering approximately 60,000 troops by 1924, encountered indigenous forces that employed guerrilla tactics learned from observation of other anti-colonial movements and possessed modern weapons acquired through arms smuggling from French and British sources. The Spanish defeat at the Battle of Annual on July 22, 1921, where Abdelkrim's forces killed over 8,000 Spanish soldiers and captured enormous quantities of military equipment, revealed the limitations of Spanish military capabilities and the effectiveness of indigenous resistance movements. The Spanish use of chemical weapons against rift populations during the 1920s, including mustard gas and chlorine gas delivered by aircraft, represented one of the earliest systematic applications of chemical warfare against civilian populations and demonstrated Spanish determination to maintain colonial control regardless of international law or humanitarian concerns. The bombing campaigns conducted by Spanish aircraft, targeting markets, villages, and agricultural areas, aimed to destroy the foundations of indigenous resistance while terrorizing populations into submission. The international condemnation of Spanish chemical weapons use, particularly from the League of Nations, created diplomatic complications that Spain ignored in pursuit of military victory over Abdelkrim's forces. The eventual suppression of the Rift Rebellion in 1926, achieved through the combined efforts of Spanish and French forces totaling over 150,000 troops, eliminated the most serious challenge to Spanish colonial authority in Morocco but at enormous financial and human cost. The Spanish military expenditure during the Rift War exceeded 2 billion pesetas, representing approximately 20% of the national budget and requiring foreign borrowing that created long-term financial obligations. The Spanish casualties, totaling over 17,000 killed and wounded, included experienced officers and enlisted men whose loss weakened Spanish military capabilities during the political instability that would characterize the 1930s. Spanish Equatorial Guinea, comprising the island of Fernando Po and the mainland territory of Rio Muni, represented Spain's only sub-Saharan African colony and provided limited economic benefits through cacao production and timber extraction. The Spanish colonization of these territories, beginning in the 18th century through treaties with local rulers, had created a colonial administration that governed approximately 300,000 inhabitants scattered across territories totaling 28,000 square kilometers. The development of cacao plantations on Fernando Po, worked by laborers imported from Nigeria and other British territories, generated modest profits for Spanish colonial companies but required constant negotiation with British authorities who controlled the regional labor supply. The Spanish colonial administration in Equatorial Guinea, centered in the capital of Santa Isabel on Fernando Po, employed fewer than 500 Spanish officials and military personnel to govern territories that lacked the infrastructure and economic development that characterized other European colonies in Africa. The absence of significant mineral resources, combined with a challenging tropical climate and limited transportation networks, made Equatorial Guinea a colonial backwater that attracted minimal Spanish investment or immigration. The Spanish cultural and linguistic influence in these territories remained limited to coastal towns and administrative centers, while the majority of the population maintained traditional political structures and cultural practices. The demographic impact of Spanish colonialism in the Americas created lasting population patterns that reflected the complex racial mixing that had characterized Spanish colonial society for 3 centuries. The mestizo populations of Mexico, Central America, and the Andean regions represented the biological legacy of Spanish colonization and the social systems that had encouraged intermarriage between Spanish men and indigenous women. The 1900 Mexican census recorded approximately 7.5 million people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, representing 43% of the national population and reflecting the demographic transformation that Spanish colonialism had created through the encomienda system, urban development, and religious conversion programs. The Afro-descendant populations of the Caribbean, coastal South America, and Pacific regions of Colombia and Ecuador represented the demographic legacy of the transatlantic slave trade that had transported over 12 million Africans to Spanish-American territories between 1501 and 1866. The African cultural influences that survived slavery and colonial oppression manifested themselves in religious practices, musical traditions, culinary customs, and linguistic patterns that became integral components of Spanish-American national cultures. The Afro-Cuban religious traditions, including Santeria and Regla de Oca, combined Yoruba spiritual practices with Catholic symbolism to create syncretic belief systems that preserved African cultural elements while adapting to colonial conditions. The indigenous populations that survived Spanish colonization, numbering approximately 40 million people by 1900, maintained distinct cultural identities and political structures despite centuries of Spanish attempts at cultural assimilation and political integration. The Quechua-speaking populations of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador preserved pre-Columbian agricultural techniques, textile production methods, and social organization patterns that enabled them to maintain cultural autonomy within Spanish colonial and republican political systems. The Maya populations of Guatemala, southern Mexico, and Belize retained their languages, religious practices, and community governance structures while adapting to Spanish colonial demands for tribute, labor, and religious conversion. The linguistic legacy of Spanish colonialism created the foundation for modern Spanish-American national identities and provided the communication networks that enabled independence movements to coordinate their activities across vast geographical distances. The Spanish language, imposed through colonial educational systems, religious instruction, and administrative requirements, became the lingua franca that united diverse indigenous populations under common political and cultural frameworks. The regional variations in Spanish-American dialects reflected the geographical isolation and cultural mixing that had characterized colonial development, with distinct vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammatical patterns emerging in different regions. The Catholic Church's role in Spanish colonial society created religious institutions and cultural practices that continued to influence Spanish-American societies long after independence. The cathedral schools, universities, and seminaries established during the colonial period provided the educational foundations that enabled Creole elites to develop the intellectual frameworks necessary for independence movements and republican government. The University of San Marcos in Lima, founded in 1551, and the University of Mexico, established in 1553, produced generations of lawyers, physicians, and clergy who served throughout the Spanish Empire and later became leaders of independent nations. The architectural legacy of Spanish colonialism, visible in the Baroque churches, colonial palaces, and urban planning that characterized Spanish-American cities, represented the cultural synthesis that had emerged from the interaction between European, indigenous, and African artistic traditions. The Cathedral of Mexico City, constructed between 1573 and 1813, combined European, Gothic, and Renaissance architectural elements with indigenous decorative motifs and construction techniques to create a distinctly Spanish-American architectural style. The colonial cities of Cuzco, Quito and Cartagena preserved urban layouts and architectural ensembles that reflected Spanish colonial planning principles, while incorporating local materials and artistic traditions. The economic structures that Spanish colonialism had created, including the hacienda system, mining operations, and commercial networks, continued to influence Spanish-American development patterns throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The concentration of land ownership in the hands of small elite groups, established during the colonial period through encomienda grants and subsequent land purchases, created patterns of rural inequality that persisted despite independence and various reform movements. The hacienda system's emphasis on export agriculture and the extraction of raw materials for European markets established economic dependencies that continued to characterize Spanish-American relationships with industrialist nations. The legal systems that Spanish colonialism had established, based on Roman law traditions and adapted to colonial conditions through the laws of the Indies, provided the institutional foundations for Spanish-American republican governments. The Spanish colonial legal tradition, which emphasized written law codes, professional legal education, and centralized judicial administration, contrasted with the common law systems that characterized British colonial territories and influenced the development of different governmental structures in Spanish and English America. The civil law tradition that Spanish colonialism had established continued to govern property rights, family relations, and commercial transactions throughout Spanish America. The mining techniques and metallurgical knowledge that Spanish colonialism had developed, particularly in the silver mines of Potosí and Tecas, represented technological innovations that influenced global mining practices and economic development. The mercury amalgamation process, perfected in Spanish-American mines during the 16th century, enabled the extraction of silver from low-grade ores and made possible the massive silver production that financed Spanish imperial expansion. The hydraulic mining techniques developed in Spanish-American gold mines, along with the organizational systems that managed indigenous and enslaved labor forces, provided models that were later applied in mining operations throughout the world. The agricultural innovations that Spanish colonialism had introduced, including new crops, livestock, and cultivation techniques, transformed the ecological and economic landscapes of the Americas, while creating the agricultural foundations for modern Spanish-American societies. The introduction of wheat, rice, sugarcane, and coffee created new agricultural sectors that generated export revenues and supported urban populations, while European livestock, including cattle, horses, and pigs, provided protein sources and transportation that had not existed in pre-Columbian America. The Spanish colonial agricultural system, which combined European crops and techniques with indigenous knowledge and labor, created the mixed farming systems that continue to characterize Spanish-American agriculture. The commercial networks that Spanish colonialism had established, connecting American production centers with European markets through the fleet system and Pacific trade routes, created the infrastructure for global commerce that continued to influence international trade patterns. The Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, which operated from 1565 to 1815, established the first regular trans-Pacific commercial route and connected Asian markets with American silver production. The Spanish colonial commercial system, despite its monopolistic restrictions and bureaucratic inefficiencies, created the port facilities, transportation networks, and financial institutions that enabled Spanish-American countries to participate in global commerce following independence. The scientific knowledge that Spanish colonial institutions had accumulated through botanical expeditions, geographical surveys, and medical research contributed to global understanding of American natural resources and indigenous knowledge systems. The Royal Botanical Garden of Madrid, established in 1755, housed collections of American plants and maintained correspondence with colonial botanists who cataloged the flora of Spanish-American territories. The scientific expeditions sponsored by the Spanish Crown, including the Malaspina expedition and the botanical surveys of José Celestino Mutis, produced detailed documentation of American natural resources that influenced European scientific understanding and economic development. The historical assessment of Spanish imperial rule requires acknowledgement of both the cultural achievements and the enormous human costs that characterized Spanish colonialism over 3 centuries. The Spanish Empire's creation of the first global commercial network, its development of administrative systems that govern diverse populations across vast distances, and its facilitation of cultural exchange between Europe, America, Africa, and Asia represented unprecedented achievements in human organization and cultural synthesis. The Spanish colonial system's ability to maintain political control over territories encompassing 13 million square kilometers while integrating millions of people into a common political and religious framework demonstrated organizational capabilities that no previous empire had achieved. The human costs of Spanish colonialism, including the demographic catastrophe that reduced indigenous populations by 80 to 90%, the enslavement of millions of Africans, and the systematic destruction of indigenous political and religious institutions, represented one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. The Spanish colonial system's reliance on forced labor, its implementation of racial hierarchies that denied political and economic opportunities to non-European populations, and its systematic exploitation of American resources for European benefit created patterns of inequality and underdevelopment that continued to influence Spanish-American societies long after independence. The Spanish Empire's final dissolution in 1976, with the independence of Equatorial Guinea, marked the end of an imperial system that had lasted 484 years and had encompassed territories on 6 continents. The Spanish colonial legacy, embedded in the languages, religions, legal systems, and cultural practices of over 500 million people, represented one of the most extensive and enduring examples of European imperial expansion. The transformation of Spanish colonial territories into independent nations, while eliminating Spanish political control, preserved many of the cultural and institutional patterns that Spanish colonialism had established, creating the foundation for the modern Spanish-speaking world that extends from Mexico to Argentina and from the Philippines to Equatorial Guinea. The Spanish Empire's historical significance lies not only in its territorial extent and duration, but in its role as the first global empire that connected all inhabited continents through regular commercial, administrative, and cultural exchange. The Spanish colonial system's integration of European, indigenous, African, and Asian populations created new forms of cultural synthesis and social organization that influenced the development of modern global civilization. The Spanish Empire's rise and fall spanning nearly 5 centuries provides essential insights into the dynamics of imperial expansion, the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances, and the ultimate limitations of imperial power in the face of local resistance and changing global conditions.